It was Christmas Eve in a small town in Vermont, the kind of place where the snow clings to every branch and the streets are nearly empty after dark. I had just moved back home after college for the holidays, eager to spend time with my parents and younger sister. The house felt familiar and comforting as I stepped inside, the smell of pine and cinnamon filling the air. Mom was bustling around the kitchen preparing dinner, and Dad was sitting in his recliner, half watching a Christmas movie, half dozing off. Everything felt normal, almost too perfect. After unpacking my bag, I went to my room to drop off my things. As I closed the door, a strange chill ran down my spine. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, and there was a faint scent of something damp and earthy that didn't belong. I shrugged it off, assuming the old windows were just letting in drafts, and decided to check on the Christmas tree in the living room. It was beautifully decorated, lights twinkling softly, but something about it seemed off. One of the ornaments, a little wooden snowman I remembered from my childhood, had been turned around. Its back faced us, the painted eyes staring away. I spun it around, but the feeling of unease lingered. Dinner was normal enough. We laughed, exchanged small gifts, and even my dad seemed slightly more animated than usual. But later, after my sister went to bed, my parents and I sat in the living room by the fireplace. That's when the noises started. At first, it was soft, a tapping against the window. I assumed it was ice or a branch scraping against the glass, but then I heard it again, louder and more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. The sound didn't match any wind I had ever heard in the house. It was steady, slow, and deliberate, almost like someone was trying to get our attention. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking at my parents. Dad shook his head, muttering something about old houses settling. Mom gave me a nervous smile, but didn't speak. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint scratching, like claws scraping across wood. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon had found its way onto the porch. But something about the rhythm was unnerving. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping had stopped, but now I could hear footsteps in the attic above my room. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. I knew the attic was empty. We hadn't stored anything up there in years. My heart was pounding. I considered waking my parents, but decided to investigate first. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow attic stairs. The attic was empty. Boxes were stacked neatly against the walls, the only sound my own breathing and the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I was about to leave when I saw it, faint scratches on the wooden floorboards that hadn't been there before, long, deep, and jagged, leading from one corner of the attic to the other. My stomach twisted. It didn't look like animal scratches. Too precise, too intentional. I went back to my room, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then I saw it in the hallway mirror, a reflection that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, tall and thin, hunched over, standing just at the edge of the hallway. I spun around. Nothing. Just the dim glow of the Christmas lights in the living room. My hands were shaking as I tried to calm myself. The next morning, we exchanged presents, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled over the house. But that night, it escalated. The tapping returned, this time from the front door. Tap, tap, tap. But there was another sound too, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, cold and guttural, like someone or something was speaking just behind the walls. I woke my parents, panicked. Dad grabbed a flashlight and went to check the front door. He opened it and nothing was there, just snow, crisp and undisturbed. But then he froze, his face paling. "Look at the footprints," he said, voice barely audible. Outside, in the freshly fallen snow, were footprints leading up to the door, human-sized but elongated, like the person had abnormally long feet. And they didn't stop at the porch. They continued, vanishing into the woods behind the house. We called the police. They came, checked the area, and found nothing. Just the footprints, which had no clear origin. They suggested it was probably a prank, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was watching us. The nights that followed were worse. The tapping, the whispering, the movement in the attic, it all intensified. One night I woke to the sound of glass breaking. I ran to the living room and found one of the ornaments shattered on the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. Scrawled across the wall in the condensation from the cold was a message. "Leave." We debated leaving, but it was Christmas, and we didn't want to abandon the house. Instead, we tried to ignore it, but ignoring it didn't work. One night, the lights went out, and in the darkness, we heard breathing, slow, deep, coming from all directions. I grabbed my sister and huddled with my parents in the kitchen. The house creaked and moaned as if alive. And then a voice, clear and malevolent, whispered my name from the living room. Dad, desperate, grabbed a baseball bat and went to investigate. I followed, clutching my sister's hand. What we saw made our blood run cold. The Christmas tree was moving on its own. Ornaments twisted, lights flickered, and beneath the tree, something crouched. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, its eyes glowing faintly red in the darkness. It tilted its head unnaturally, watching us. We screamed, and it bolted into the corner of the room, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The lights flickered back on, and the house was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. We stayed up the rest of the night, armed with whatever we could find. Every shadow, every creak, every draft made us jump. By morning, we were exhausted, but the creature, or whatever it was gone. The only evidence left were the long scratches on the floors, the deep footprints outside, and the shattered ornaments. Christmas morning came, but the joy was gone. We opened presents mechanically, avoiding each other's eyes. The memory of the night before hung heavy. We never spoke about it again, at least not aloud. But I knew, deep down, that the house was no longer ours. Something had marked it, and it would return. Years later, I drove past that house. It was still standing, snow-covered and quiet. But in the window, I thought I saw a shadow watching, waiting for Christmas to come again. And I knew that whatever had haunted us that year was still there, patient and relentless, waiting for the next family foolish enough to celebrate in its presence. I never went back. Not for holidays, not for visits, not for anything. The memory of that Christmas, the cold, the shadows, the whispers, stayed with me. And every December when the first snow falls, I can't help but remember the tapping, the eyes, the message on the wall. It wasn't Santa Claus bringing joy that year. It was something else, something that thrived on fear and darkness. And for us, Christmas will never be the same. Story the end. The Johnsons had always celebrated Christmas with a sense of tradition and routine. Every year, they would drive out to the small cabin near Lake Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Paul Johnson's parents had spent their winters for decades. It was a modest two-story structure, wooden and worn but sturdy, surrounded by thick woods that stretched to the frozen lake. Snow fell constantly in early December, coating the trees in heavy white and muffling all sound except the occasional crack of a branch under its weight. This year, the family decided to arrive a few days early to get a head start on decorating. Paul, 38, drove while his wife, Jessica, 36, and their two children, 12-year-old Claire and 8-year-old Ben, sat bundled in layers of sweaters and blankets. The cabin looked just as Paul remembered, dark wood walls, a stone fireplace, and a single lamp casting a warm glow in the living room. The first night was peaceful, the kind of quiet that only comes with isolation. They hung lights on the tree, baked cookies, and shared stories from past holidays. But on the second night, things began to feel off. Jessica was the first to notice it. While tucking Ben into bed, she thought she heard whispering from the living room. "Paul?" she called softly, thinking he might be moving around downstairs. No response. She stepped into the hallway, her bare feet cold on the wood floor. The whispers stopped. She shook her head and returned to Ben's room, dismissing it as her imagination. Later that evening, Paul was in the kitchen making cocoa when he noticed something strange. The front door, which he was certain he had locked, was slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine, and he quickly secured it, double-checking the locks. The storm outside had picked up, snow blowing in thick gusts. Whoever or whatever had opened the door would have left footprints, but none were visible in the pristine snow just outside. That night, Claire woke screaming. Paul and Jessica rushed to her room to find her pointing at the corner, shaking violently. "The man!" she cried. "He's in the corner." There was nothing there, only shadows cast by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Paul tried to calm her, telling her it was just a dream, but the fear in her eyes was real, the kind of fear that sinks into the bones. The following morning, the family found more signs that something was wrong. Small scratches marred the wood near the fireplace, black streaks on the stone that neither of them could explain. Ben's toys were scattered, though they had been neatly put away. And on the wall near the stairs, a phrase had been scratched deep into the paint. "You are not alone." Jessica's hands shook as she called the local sheriff, but the storm had knocked out phone lines. The isolation that had seemed peaceful now felt suffocating. Paul tried to rationalize the events, blaming the children's imagination and the stress of travel, but even he couldn't ignore the unease creeping through the house. That night, around 10 p.m., the power went out completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the fireplace and the moon. Paul lit candles, their small flames flickering across the walls, creating dancing shadows. The children were tucked into their beds, though Claire refused to sleep, insisting that the man in the corner was still watching. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards above them. Paul grabbed a flashlight and cautiously ascended the stairs. Nothing. The bedrooms were empty, doors shut, the air thick and cold. He returned downstairs, feeling a creeping sense of being watched. A sudden crash erupted from the living room. The Christmas tree had toppled, ornaments shattered across the floor. Paul's heart pounded as he saw the fireplace hearth disturbed, ash scattered, and then he noticed the doll from the children's bedroom lying face down among the ornaments. Claire's favorite, yet it had moved far from where it had been left. The whispers started again, low at first, barely audible. Jessica froze, holding Ben close. The words seemed to echo through the walls. Leave now or stay forever. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the candlelight. Paul shone the flashlight into the corner of the room, and for a fleeting moment he saw a figure crouched in the shadows, tall, thin, impossibly angular, with dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. Then it vanished. Panic overtook rational thought. Paul grabbed the children, and they all tried to leave, only to find the front door locked tight. The windows wouldn't budge. The cabin seemed alive, walls shifting imperceptibly, tightening around them. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of voices, some speaking words they couldn't understand, others repeating their names. Hours dragged on. The children cried and clung to their parents, unable to sleep. The figure, or figures, remained unseen, but the signs of their presence were everywhere. Scratches in the wood, smudges on the walls, footprints appearing in the snow outside that led nowhere. At one point, Ben screamed that something had touched his foot under the covers. Jessica tried to soothe him, but when she reached down, the bed was empty. They searched the cabin, room by room, finding more disturbing messages scratched into walls and furniture. "Do not leave. He is here. We see you." By dawn, the storm had lifted, leaving a blanket of untouched snow. Paul ventured outside to see if there was any sign of what had been tormenting them, but the footprints that had appeared overnight led into the woods and disappeared. There was no evidence of trespassers, no tracks, nothing but snow and silence. Reluctantly, they decided to pack up and leave immediately. The drive back to town was tense, every shadow in the trees making them flinch. The children were silent, staring at the passing woods, whispering about the man who had watched them in the cabin. Paul tried to reassure them, but he too felt the lingering presence, the sense that something had followed them. Weeks later, Paul and Jessica received a call from the new owners of the cabin, who had returned to check on it. They reported strange noises at night, lights flickering, and scratches appearing on walls with no explanation. Paul hung up, realizing with a chill that whatever had haunted their Christmas had not left the cabin behind. It was still there, waiting for the next family foolish enough to enter. The Johnsons never returned to Lake Harmony. Every winter, they remembered the cabin, the whispers, the shadows in the corner of the room, and the icy fingers brushing their skin. They warned friends to stay away, to heed the signs that had been ignored. And sometimes late at night, when snow falls thick and heavy, Claire whispers to her mother, afraid to sleep alone, "He's coming back." Even years later, the memory of that Christmas remains vivid. The feeling of being watched, the whispers echoing through the cabin, the messages carved into the walls. The Johnson family learned that isolation can be deadly, and that some places, no matter how quaint, no matter how festive, are better left alone during the holidays. Story the end. The wind had been relentless all day in the small town of Fairview, Pennsylvania, whipping through the streets and rattling the windows of the Thompson family's home. Snow had piled up quickly, and by evening the town was blanketed in thick, powdery white. Inside the Thompson house, the family tried to ignore the storm outside. David Thompson sat at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee. His wife, Maria, was stringing popcorn garlands for the Christmas tree, which stood in the corner of the living room, half decorated. Their children, Lily, 9, and Max, 6, were sprawled on the floor, excitedly opening small presents they had received earlier that day from neighbors and relatives. David forced a smile, but the weight of the past year hung heavily on him. He had lost his job at a local manufacturing plant in September, and since then, things had been tight. Maria tried to keep spirits high, but even she couldn't mask the underlying tension that seemed to hang over their household. Around 8 o'clock, a knock echoed through the house. Startled, David frowned. Nobody was supposed to come out this far in the snowstorm. He opened the door cautiously to find a man standing on the porch, wearing a thick red coat and a Santa hat dusted with snow. His beard was stringy and dirty, and his eyes glimmered unnaturally in the dim porch light. "Merry Christmas," the man said, his voice uneven, almost croaking. "I've got a gift for your little ones." David hesitated. We weren't expecting." The man held up a small, ornately wrapped package. "No problem, just a gift from me to them." Without waiting for a response, he placed it on the porch and stepped back into the blizzard. David shut the door and stared at the snow, heart thudding, before bringing the package inside. The children squealed with excitement when they saw it. The paper was heavy, glossy, decorated with strange symbols David didn't recognize. Inside the wrapping was a small wooden music box, carved with intricate scenes of a snow-covered village. The figures on the box seemed almost alive, moving subtly as the light hit them. Lily wound the key, and the music box began to play a soft, tinkling melody. At first, it was cheerful, a typical Christmas tune. But soon the notes warped, slowing in a way that made the song sound stretched, off-key. David felt a chill crawl up his spine as the temperature in the room dropped. The fireplace flickered weakly, unable to provide any warmth. "Turn it off," Maria whispered, unease lacing her voice. David reached for the box, but the lid wouldn't close. The figures inside seemed to twist and contort under the faint light of the tree. Then came the whispers, barely audible at first, like someone speaking in the next room, but growing louder by the second. The words were indistinct, but the tone was insistent, pleading, "Open, let us in, let us see." Lily and Max were mesmerized, staring at the box. Their eyes seemed distant, unfocused, and David realized with horror that they were no longer aware of him or Maria. The shadows in the room began to lengthen unnaturally, stretching along the walls and creeping across the floor like living tendrils. Suddenly, a loud banging came from the kitchen. Maria grabbed a kitchen knife and cautiously approached the source. The pantry door was swinging violently, though the windows were locked and the wind was outside, not in. The banging became a scratching, a sound like claws scraping wood. Then a shape appeared in the doorway. It was a man, or what had once been a man, in a Santa suit, but his body was grotesque and elongated, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. His eyes were hollow, dark pits, and his mouth stretched into a horrifying grin. Behind him, more figures emerged, shadowy and thin, their limbs bending in impossible angles, faces featureless. David tried to grab his children, but they were already standing, moving toward the box with blank expressions. The shadows seemed to pull them forward, drawing them closer to the music box. Maria screamed, trying to drag them back, but her hands passed through the children as if they were smoke. The room seemed to warp around them. Walls stretched, the ceiling sagged, and the fireplace roared as if in protest. The music box melody slowed even further, now a low, guttural drone. The figures in the room began to speak in unison, a chorus of voices overlapping in a nightmarish chant. "Join us. Forever." In a desperate move, Maria snatched the music box and hurled it into the fireplace. Flames erupted, twisting and surging unnaturally, consuming the box. The shadow figures shrieked, a sound that was both human and something else entirely, echoing in the room with an intensity that made the windows rattle. For a moment, everything went silent. The room was dark, the fire reduced to embers, and the air was still, cold, but quiet. David and Maria clutched each other, checking the children, but they were gone. The only thing left was a faint smell of iron and burnt wood, lingering in the air like a warning. David ran outside, calling for Lily and Max, but the snow-covered yard was empty. The storm had stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving a thick blanket of untouched snow. The neighbors' houses were dark and silent. The only sign of life was the faint music, distorted, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the woods behind their house. The next day, the police were called. The Thompson house was searched thoroughly. There was no evidence of a break-in, no tracks in the snow besides their own, and no sign of the children anywhere. The music box was gone. It was as if the night had never happened, except for the lingering frost patterns that had formed on the windows in strange, intricate designs. Months passed. The Thompsons never saw their children again. The house remained empty, though locals swear they sometimes hear faint Christmas carols at night, warped and eerie, coming from the direction of the woods. Packages sometimes appear on porches in Fairview, small wooden boxes carved with strange figures, always with a faint metallic scent, always humming with a distorted tune. People who open them are rarely seen again. Some say it's the spirits of lost children, trapped in a wintry nightmare, brought into the world by a twisted version of Santa Claus. Others insist it's punishment for despair, for families weighed down by sorrow, grief, or desperation. No one truly knows why it chooses the families it does, or why the music box always appears in the snow on Christmas Eve. The Thompson house stands empty to this day. The windows are dark and snow piles high around the porch every year. And every Christmas, if the wind is just right, the faint sound of that warped, haunting music drifts through the air, a chilling reminder that joy and terror can sometimes walk hand in hand during the holiday season. Story the end. The snow had started falling early that Christmas Eve in the small town of Pine Hollow, Michigan, coating the streets in a thick, silent white. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than usual, pressing down on the houses with an almost tangible weight. Most people were at home, preparing for family dinners, wrapping presents, or driving to visit loved ones. For the Peterson family, this Christmas was supposed to be ordinary. Cozy, filled with warmth and laughter, but it quickly turned into something far darker. John Peterson, a construction worker, had spent the day clearing snow from his driveway and checking the roof for ice dams. His wife, Margaret, was in the kitchen, cooking the turkey and sides, while their two children, 12-year-old Ben and 7-year-old Clara, decorated the Christmas tree. Everything seemed normal until the first strange knock came at the door. It was soft, deliberate, 3 knocks in succession. John frowned. Visitors were rare in Pine Hollow, especially on a snowy Christmas Eve. He opened the door to find nothing but snow drifting down from the sky and a set of footprints leading from the edge of the driveway to the porch. Footprints far too large for any of their neighbors. The prints ended at the steps, as if whoever or whatever made them had vanished into thin air. Shrugging it off as a prank or a trick of the light, John closed the door, but the unease lingered. That night, as the family sat around the tree, the power flickered. Lights dimmed, then went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. Margaret lit candles, and their soft glow cast long, unsettling shadows across the living room. Ben clutched his new video game console, whispering that he felt someone watching from outside. Clara, usually fearless, buried herself in her mother's lap. The knocking started again, this time from the basement. It was slow, heavy, deliberate. John's blood ran cold. Their basement door was old and creaky. Opening it required both strength and caution. He grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the steps. The air at the bottom was unnaturally cold, carrying a metallic tang that made his stomach turn. The flashlight flickered, revealing the dark corner of the basement and a figure standing there. It was tall, impossibly thin, draped in tattered black fabric that obscured its face. 2 glowing red eyes reflected the flashlight's beam. John froze. The figure didn't move, but its presence was oppressive, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. When he tried to speak, his voice caught in his throat. Upstairs, Margaret screamed. Clara was pointing toward the staircase, her voice trembling. Ben whispered, "It's coming upstairs." John spun around, but the figure was gone. The basement was empty. The flashlight flickered again, then steadied. The air warmed slightly, but the oppressive feeling remained. Suddenly, the front door rattled violently, as if something massive was trying to force its way in. John ran to the door, pushing a chair against it, but the banging continued, echoing through the house. The windows rattled. A low, guttural whisper filled the rooms, repeating Clara's name over and over. Margaret held the children tightly, tears streaming down her face. John tried calling 911, but the lines were dead. The sound of footsteps came from the attic. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The attic staircase was narrow, and accessing it required a small, foldable ladder that John kept in the corner. He hesitated, heart racing. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence so thick it was suffocating. Then came a whisper, closer this time, from inside the walls. Ben. Clara. Panicking, John grabbed his children and fled toward the living room. Shadows flickered across the walls, twisting unnaturally. The candles sputtered, throwing grotesque shapes. Margaret tried to reassure the kids, but the fear in her own voice betrayed her. Then it happened. The basement door slammed open with such force that the entire house shook. From the darkness came the figure, its red eyes glowing brighter, its form taller and thinner than before. It didn't speak. It didn't move like a normal person. Its presence alone was enough to make John stumble back, dropping the flashlight. Clara screamed. Ben tried to grab her, but his arms felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on them. Margaret pushed them both behind her, trying to shield them. The figure advanced, not walking, but gliding, silent except for the faint scraping sound of its tattered robes against the floor. John grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal fire poker, and swung it blindly at the figure. It passed right through the thing as if it were smoke, and the red eyes flared. A cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing the candles. The temperature dropped sharply. Their breath became visible, crystallizing in the air. The figure vanished as suddenly as it appeared. Silence returned. John, Margaret, and the children huddled together, shaking, listening for any sign that it might return. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the footprints that had led to their home. Everything looked normal from the street, except for the faint, lingering sense of being watched. By morning, the family's neighbors had begun checking on them after seeing the chaos from outside. The Peterson house appeared undisturbed from the street, aside from the broken candle and a faint trail of soot from the fireplace where the family had huddled. There were no footprints leading away, no sign that anyone or anything had been inside. Yet John and Margaret knew the truth. The rest of the holiday season passed uneventfully, but the Petersons were never the same. Ben stopped sleeping in his room, insisting on a light left on at all times. Clara refused to look out the windows, claiming she could still see red eyes in the snow. Margaret found herself checking locks repeatedly, even during the day, and John became irritable and tense, jumping at every sound. Over the next several years, the Petersons tried to move past the incident, but the memories haunted them. Every Christmas Eve, the house felt colder than it should. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and sometimes faint scratching or whispering would wake them in the middle of the night. No one else ever saw the figure. It was always just them, alone with its presence. The town of Pine Hollow whispered about the Peterson house. Some claimed it was haunted. Others said it was the work of a prankster or disturbed mind. But those who had been inside the house that night, or lived through it, knew it was real. They knew that whatever had come that Christmas was patient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right time to return. John and Margaret eventually moved away, taking Ben and Clara with them. Yet the fear did not leave them. In their new home, miles from Pine Hollow, strange things began happening every Christmas Eve. Lights flickering, shadows moving oddly, whispers in the walls, the cold touch of something unseen. And every year, the children would wake screaming, swearing they saw the tall, thin figure standing silently in the yard or in the corner of their bedroom, its red eyes glowing, watching, waiting. Even as adults, Ben and Clara carry the memory with them. No amount of therapy, no rational explanation, no attempt to ignore it has ever erased the fear. They have learned to live with it, to lock doors, double-check windows, and sleep with lights on. But every Christmas Eve, without fail, the memory returns with a sharp clarity. The figure, its red eyes, the suffocating cold, and the sense that it never leaves. Neighbors and friends dismiss it as overactive imagination or trauma, but the Petersons know better. Whatever it wasn't human, and it had chosen them. Christmas, the time of warmth and family, had become a time of terror. They learned that some horrors are patient, some are silent, and some only reveal themselves when you're most vulnerable, when the world is quiet, and when the snow falls heavily on the night of Christmas. To this day, the Petersons keep their lights on, check locks repeatedly, and never allow anyone to be alone on Christmas Eve. Even miles away, even years later, they feel its presence lurking in the corners, waiting for a chance to return. And they know with every fiber of their being that when it does, it will not be a visitor to welcome. They will be the prey. Story the end. The snow had been falling steadily all day, thick and heavy, blanketing the streets of our small town in northern Vermont. It was Christmas Eve, and the roads were nearly empty, except for the occasional car struggling through the drifts. I had driven out from Burlington to spend the holidays at my friend's family cabin, tucked deep in the mountains near Lake Willoughby. It was a place I had visited as a teenager before my parents split and life got complicated. The cabin belonged to my old friend Matt and his parents, who had recently passed away in a car accident. Matt had invited me to help him maintain the place as he planned to spend Christmas alone, keeping the memory of his family alive. The drive was long, and by the time I arrived, the sun was gone, swallowed by a dark, cloudy sky that made the snow even more oppressive. Matt was waiting outside, waving as I pulled up, bundled in his winter coat, scarf, and mittens. He looked thinner than I remembered, pale and anxious. "Glad you made it," he said, gripping my shoulder as we entered the cabin. "The storm's coming in fast. Roads might be closed by morning." Inside, the cabin smelled like old pine and wood smoke, a comforting but slightly musty aroma. The fire in the stone fireplace cast flickering shadows across the room. Matt led me to the main living area where a small Christmas tree had been decorated, mostly homemade ornaments, some with our names written on them from years ago. We tried to make the evening feel festive. Matt made some hot chocolate while I unpacked my bag. For a while, the storm outside felt like a cozy backdrop, the way I remembered from childhood holidays. But as the night deepened, the cabin's silence grew heavier. Around midnight, the lights flickered. The storm outside was picking up, shaking the cabin with gusts that sounded like they could tear the walls apart. I told myself it was just old wiring, though the brief darkness made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a faint thump from upstairs. "Matt?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. He looked up, frowning. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I didn't argue. I wanted to believe him, but the sound had been distinct, deliberate, like someone stepping on the wooden floorboards. I stayed on the couch, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then came another sound, another thump, this one closer, followed by the creak of the staircase. I froze. My heart was hammering. Matt grabbed a flashlight and motioned for me to stay put. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll check it out." I nodded, though I hated being left alone. I could hear him ascending the stairs, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. Then silence. Seconds stretched into minutes. I wanted to follow, but a part of me was terrified to move. Then I heard it, a slow, dragging sound coming from the hall upstairs. It wasn't Matt. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as quietly as I could, but there was no signal. The cabin was too far from the nearest tower. Panic set in. I could hear Matt calling my name upstairs, his voice echoing strangely. Then a loud crash, like a heavy object falling, shattered the tension. I ran to the staircase. "Matt!" I yelled, but only silence answered. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs. The door to his parents' old bedroom was wide open. The room was empty, but the floor was covered with footprints, wet, muddy footprints that hadn't been there before. They led to the closet. I hesitated, then opened the closet door. Inside was darkness, suffocating and deep. I shone my flashlight in. There was nothing at first, just coats and boxes. But then I noticed something odd. A figure crouched at the back, a man in dark clothes, his face obscured. He didn't move, but the way he was positioned, watching me, made me freeze. Before I could react, he sprang forward, running past me and out the window. I ran to it, heart pounding. The snow outside was deep, but there was a trail, footprints leading into the trees, away from the cabin. I called Matt again. He didn't answer. I ran downstairs, searching the main floor. The front door was wide open. The fire had been extinguished, and a strange, acrid smell filled the cabin, like smoke mixed with something metallic. Suddenly, Matt came running down the driveway from the side of the house, shouting, "He's gone! He's gone!" I ran to him. He was shaking violently. "What happened?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "I heard the steps upstairs, too. I ran outside, and he was just gone, into the woods. I don't know where he came from. We locked all the doors and windows and tried to call the police again, but there was still no signal." By the time the sun began to rise, the snowstorm had worsened, burying the tracks. Whatever had been in the cabin was gone, but the memory of the footprints and the figure in the closet stayed with us. The next few hours were spent nervously shoveling a path to the main road, hoping someone would drive by. When a car finally appeared, we flagged it down and made it into town. The sheriff listened to our story, skeptical at first, but agreed to drive back with us the next day to investigate. When we returned, the cabin seemed almost normal in the daylight. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or doors, and the footprints in the snow had vanished. But the bedroom closet was different. The air inside felt cold, unnaturally so. And in the corner, leaning against a box, was a small metal ornament, a reindeer figurine, one that Matt swore had been part of a box stored at the very back. It wasn't alone. Scattered around the floor were dozens of small trinkets, decorations, and photographs. Pictures of the cabin, of Matt's family, even pictures of me sleeping in the guest bed the night before. They were all time-stamped hours before we'd even arrived. The sheriff said nothing about it. He suggested we might have imagined it in our sleep-deprived state, that the storm, the isolation, and our grief could have played tricks on us. But I knew better. There was no imagination that could have accounted for the footprints, the figure in the closet, or the photographs that hadn't existed before. We left the cabin that day, taking only what we could carry. Matt never returned. He moved to another state, got a job, tried to rebuild a life that had been shattered by grief and fear. But every Christmas Eve, he would call me, his voice low, and say, "Make sure your windows are locked tonight." I never forget. I keep my phone near my bed, my doors bolted, because sometimes, even in the middle of the city, when the wind is low and the snow drifts silently against the windows, I hear it. The slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs, the drag of something heavy across the floor, and the 3 taps at the window that signal it is still out there, waiting. That Christmas, the holiday we were supposed to celebrate ended up being a warning, a reminder that grief and loss can attract more than just memories. It can attract something darker, something that knows the corners of your heart, the way your family smells when it's just a memory, and it waits until the night is quiet and you are alone. Years later, I learned that the cabin had been the site of multiple break-ins over decades. People who disappeared in the woods, their bodies never found. Local lore suggested that some men used to hide in abandoned cabins during winter storms, watching travelers, waiting. But what we experienced felt different, personal, targeted, as if something knew we were coming, knew our family, and waited for us to arrive. Even now, I avoid cabins, avoid snowstorms, avoid being alone in a place where the walls are thin and the forest watches. But every December I relive it, the figure in the closet, the footprints in the mud, the photographs, the slow, deliberate taps at the window. Because I know deep down that wherever it came from, it is still out there, waiting for the next storm, waiting for someone to let their guard down, waiting to make sure that this Christmas, someone will remember it too. Story the end. The snow had started falling early that Christmas Eve in northern Wisconsin, covering the small town of Ashfield in a thick, muffling blanket of white. Streetlights cast halos over the quiet streets, and most of the town's residents were indoors, putting the finishing touches on their holiday celebrations. For the McAllister family, it was supposed to be a calm, happy evening. Jennifer McAllister had spent the week baking cookies, wrapping presents, and setting up the Christmas tree. Her husband, Tom, had taken the day off work to help, and their 2 children, Lily and Ethan, were bouncing around with the excitement only children possess on the night before Christmas. But as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the snow-covered front yard, Jennifer felt a creeping unease she couldn't shake. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of her neck, the faint sense that someone was watching them. She brushed it off, blaming the stress of preparing for the holiday, and focused on placing the final ornaments on the tree. Lily and Ethan were playing quietly in the corner, constructing a miniature village with the leftover Christmas decorations. As darkness fell, Tom went out to the garage to retrieve some last-minute decorations. Jennifer continued tidying up, humming a Christmas tune under her breath. That's when she noticed it. A small figure standing outside the front window. She froze, thinking it was a neighbor, but the figure was too still, too wrong. A child? Perhaps. But its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it seemed to be staring directly at her, even from 20 feet away. "Tom?" she called softly, but the garage door had already shut behind him. The figure didn't move. She blinked, and when she looked again, it was gone. A shiver ran down her spine, but she forced herself to believe it was a trick of the snow and the fading light. Dinner was tense, though the family tried to keep it normal. Lily chattered happily about what Santa might bring. Ethan laughed at a story his father told, but Jennifer couldn't ignore the sensation of being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed too dark, too thick. Even the Christmas tree lights seemed to flicker in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. After dinner, the kids wanted to open one present each. Jennifer handed Lily a small box with a homemade ornament inside. As Lily tore the wrapping paper, the house lights flickered violently. The ornament inside was not the one Jennifer had made. It was a tiny carved figure of a man, but the face was wrong. Its features were distorted, twisted into a grotesque grin. Jennifer dropped it in surprise. Lily frowned but didn't seem scared, picking it up and saying it looked funny. Jennifer forced herself to laugh, convincing herself she had bought it at the craft fair without remembering. The night grew darker, and the snowstorm intensified. The wind howled, rattling the windows and doors. Tom returned from the garage carrying boxes of decorations, and together they finished decorating the tree. But as they hung the last strand of lights, the lights in the room flickered again, and a low, whispering sound seemed to come from the corners of the house. "What's that?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "Probably just the wind," Tom said, but Jennifer could hear it too, the whispering, faint but unmistakable, like a chorus of voices just beyond comprehension. She felt her stomach knot in fear. Later, after the kids had gone to bed, Jennifer went to check on them and found the bedroom door slightly ajar. She swore she had closed it. When she pushed it open, Lily was sitting upright, staring out the window, and Ethan was kneeling on the floor, arranging his toys into patterns she hadn't noticed before. "Kids, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice wavering. "They're here," Lily said softly, pointing toward the window. "The people outside. They came to play the game." Jennifer's blood ran cold. "Who's outside, honey?" "The ones who watch. They said we have to play. Or else." Jennifer's first instinct was disbelief, but as she looked out the window, the snow had been disturbed in the yard. Or footprints, or something like footprints, formed spirals in the snow, moving in impossible patterns, like they had been laid out by someone or something that didn't obey normal geometry. Shadows seemed to shift in the yard too, even though there were no streetlights to cast them. Tom came to the door, alarmed by Jennifer's expression. She tried to explain, but as she did, the power went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness except for the faint glow of the fire. Then came the sound, scratching, soft at first, coming from the walls themselves, growing louder, as if whatever was outside was trying to enter. Jennifer grabbed Tom's arm. "We have to get the kids and hide," she whispered. They ran to the basement, the kids following close behind. The basement was cold, dark, and cramped, but it was all they had. Jennifer tried to calm the children, but the scratching continued, now accompanied by low, distorted whispers repeating, "Play, the game, play, the game." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to distort in the basement. Every so often, the temperature would drop sharply, and the shadows in the corners would move unnaturally, stretching toward them. Ethan whimpered and clutched his mother's hand, while Lily, strangely calm, whispered, "They want the spiral." Jennifer didn't understand what her daughter meant. "The spiral?" she asked, voice trembling. "The pattern in the snow. They said it must be perfect," Lily said. Fear gnawed at Jennifer. She realized that the footprints outside had formed a spiral similar to the one Ethan had been arranging with his toys in the bedroom. Something outside, something unnatural, was controlling the night. As midnight approached, the basement door rattled violently. Shadows pressed against it, forming shapes that seemed human but impossibly tall, their limbs thin and elongated. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Jennifer felt herself on the brink of panic, but she knew screaming would do no good. Then, an idea came to her in desperation. She remembered the Christmas lights they had strung around the living room tree. She grabbed a heavy extension cord and dragged the box of lights down the stairs. With shaking hands, she plugged them in and switched them on. The effect was immediate. The shadows shrieked, recoiling as if the lights themselves burned them. The whispers turned into horrified, inhuman cries before vanishing into the corners of the basement. The figures outside were gone. For the first time all night, Jennifer felt a fragile hope. When the storm passed and morning came, the snow in the yard had returned to a peaceful blank sheet. The footprints and spirals were gone, as if they had never existed. Jennifer and Tom checked on the kids. They were unharmed, though pale and silent, still shaken by the terror of the night. But the house had changed in subtle ways. Ornaments on the tree were slightly rearranged. The gifts beneath it had shifted into neat, precise spirals, mirroring the pattern Jennifer had seen in the snow. And in the center of the arrangement sat the small wooden figure that had appeared in Lily's gift, its face now twisted into a smile far more sinister than before. Jennifer dropped it immediately. A faint whisper seemed to echo in the corners of her mind. Next year, we play again. Every Christmas since then, Jennifer noticed changes, subtle, unnerving. Lights flicker for no reason, shadows move where they shouldn't, and snow falls in patterns that make her stomach twist with recognition. Lily and Ethan never spoke of the night again, but Jennifer knows the memory is etched into them. They see it in the snow, in the shadows, in the flickering lights. They know the game is waiting. The McAllisters have never left Ashfield, but every December, when the snow begins to fall, Jennifer watches the yard with fear in her heart. She checks the locks, she inspects the house, she double-checks the children's rooms, and every year, without fail, she hears the whispering in the wind. Play the game. Play the game. Story the end. The snow had been falling all day in the small town of Ashwood, Ohio. By evening, the streets were blanketed in a thick, heavy layer that muffled all sound, turning the town into a silent, frozen world. Christmas lights flickered weakly on homes, their glow struggling to pierce the dim, gray sky. The Martin family, Brian, his wife Laura, and their daughter Emma, who had just turned 8, were preparing for what should have been a cozy Christmas Eve. Laura was in the kitchen, humming softly as she wrapped cinnamon rolls in foil to bake later. Brian was in the living room, hanging ornaments on the tree with Emma's help. Emma's excitement had been building for days, and tonight she was practically vibrating with anticipation. "Do you think Santa will come tonight?" she asked, her wide eyes reflecting the multicolored lights. "He better," Brian said, ruffling her hair, "or you'll have to send him a sternly worded email." He chuckled. But Laura didn't smile. She had a knot in her stomach all afternoon, a sensation she couldn't explain. The storm had been getting worse, and though the town hadn't lost power yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around 7, the power flickered once, then stabilized. Laura forced a smile. "It's just the storm," she said, though her voice was tight. Brian agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. Emma ran to the window to watch the snow falling. "Look, Mommy, the snow looks like glitter." Laura joined her, gazing out at the street. There was no one around, no cars, no neighbors, nothing. Just the slow, relentless snowfall and the skeletal trees bowing under its weight. And then she saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of their yard near the tree line. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and completely still. "Emma," Laura whispered, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Go back to the tree." Emma hesitated, but obeyed, peering nervously over her shoulder. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't even seem to breathe. It was just there, watching. Laura's heart started racing. "Brian," she called, "there's someone outside." Brian put down the ornament he was holding and went to the window. He frowned. "It's too far away to see clearly? Maybe someone got lost in the storm?" Laura shook her head. It's just standing there, watching." Brian squinted, and then his frown deepened. "It's too tall, and the way it's standing. It doesn't look right." Before they could react further, the front doorbell rang. The sound echoed unnaturally in the empty house. Emma shrieked and hid behind the couch. Brian went to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. Laura felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Don't open it," she said. "It's too late," and another knock came, this time louder, heavier, almost deliberate, the kind of knock that didn't belong to a human. Brian shook his head, frozen. I don't know," Emma whimpered. "Mommy, they're outside." Laura tried to steady herself. "It's okay, honey, it's okay." But she didn't feel okay at all. She grabbed her phone. Dead. The landline? Dead. The lights flickered, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room, save for the dim glow of the Christmas tree. The house felt colder than the storm outside, the air thick, heavy, almost viscous. A scraping sound echoed from the front porch, slow and deliberate, like fingernails on wood. Emma screamed. Brian grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Laura tried to breathe steadily, but her chest felt tight. The scraping continued, moving from the porch to the front steps, then circling the house, impossible, yet undeniable. They could hear it on the windows now, scratching against the glass. Then came a sound that froze Laura's blood, a low, guttural whisper, repeating a single word over and over. "Inside." Emma shrieked and clung to her mother. Brian shined the flashlight toward the windows and froze. Shadows flickered just beyond the glass, impossible to make out clearly, but they weren't human. They twisted unnaturally, limbs bending at odd angles, some too long, some too thin, all moving as one. Laura felt something brush her shoulder. She spun around, expecting Brian or Emma, but the space behind her was empty. The whispering grew louder, closer, circling them now, echoing from every corner. "Get to the basement!" Brian shouted, his voice sharp. "We need to hide." They ran to the basement door, but as they descended the stairs, the temperature plummeted. Frost formed instantly on the walls and floor. The flashlight flickered and went out. They were plunged into total darkness. Then they heard it. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, and impossible. The basement door rattled as if something enormous was trying to break in. Laura's hands shook as she tried to find the circuit breaker, hoping to restore the lights. The whispers had become a chorus, a cruel chant in voices not their own. "Come, come, come." Brian pressed himself against the wall, shielding Emma. The basement felt impossibly large now, the walls stretching into darkness beyond their vision. And then he saw it. A shadow slipping along the far wall, moving faster than any human could. It paused, and in the faint moonlight coming from the small basement window, he saw the face. Pale, expressionless, and horrifyingly elongated, eyes hollow, staring straight through him. Laura screamed. The shadow lunged, and Brian shoved Emma behind him. The entity seemed to dissolve into the darkness, only to reappear closer, circling them like a predator. Frosted breath hit their faces, though no wind entered the basement. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time had lost meaning. The whispers never ceased. The entity circled endlessly, stalking them. They huddled together, desperate, praying, crying, until a sound above drew their attention. The front door slamming open. The wind howled inside, snow pouring into the house, and then silence. Cautiously, Brian crept upstairs, Laura holding Emma close. The house was empty. No shadows. No scraping. The storm outside had subsided somewhat, but the living room told another story. The ornaments were smashed, the tree uprooted and splintered, and on the walls, written in frost as if by long, icy fingers, were words those that chilled them to the bone. "We will come again." The family fled to a neighbor's house, only to learn that other homes in Ashwood had experienced similar disturbances that night. Windows shattered, strange symbols etched into walls, people vanished for hours before returning, shaken and terrified, claiming shadowy figures had visited them. The Martins never spent another Christmas in their house. Every December, as snow fell, Laura would wake in the middle of the night to faint whispering, frost creeping along the edges of her windows, and the sense that something was standing just outside, waiting. Emma, now older, refused to put up a Christmas tree, afraid of shadows watching her ornaments. Brian never returned to work in Ashwood, with the town now haunted by the memory of that night. Neighbors whispered that the storm had brought something with it, something ancient, drawn to the light and warmth of homes during the coldest, darkest night of the year. Families in Ashwood learned to lock their doors tight, never answer knocks after dark, and never ever look too long at shadows in the snow, because once it sees you, it doesn't leave. Years later, the Martins would tell the story to anyone who asked, but many dismissed it as an overactive imagination or a result of cabin fever during a storm. Yet every December, when the wind whistles through Ashwood and snow piles against windows, they remember the shadowy figures, the whispers, the frost that moved like fingers, and the way Christmas Eve changed their lives forever. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in the quiet town of Ashford, Maine, and the snow had been falling steadily since dawn. Streetlights glimmered through the thick, icy flakes, illuminating the small shops and houses that lined Main Street. Most families were busy with last-minute preparations, baking, wrapping presents, and setting out stockings. But for the Thompson family, this Christmas would not be ordinary. David Thompson had insisted on a quiet holiday at home with his wife, Karen, and their 2 children, 11-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Ethan. They had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, far enough to be away from the usual holiday chaos, nestled against a thick forest that many locals said was haunted in old stories. David thought the tales were just that, old legends meant to scare children. But as the evening unfolded, he would regret ever dismissing them. The family spent the day decorating the cabin. Lily hung ornaments on the small pine tree, while Ethan draped tinsel across the mantel. Karen prepared a simple dinner, the smell of roast chicken and cinnamon filling the cozy cabin. Outside, the snow fell silently, muffling every sound. It was the perfect Christmas Eve, or so it seemed. After dinner, they gathered in the living room to exchange small gifts. David handed Lily a necklace, and Karen gave Ethan a small model train. The children's laughter echoed warmly in the cabin, but in the back of David's mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest outside the window seemed darker than usual, the trees swaying despite the lack of wind. As the night deepened, strange things began to happen. Lily was the first to notice. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It sounded like someone is walking outside." David looked toward the window. The snow-covered yard stretched for several feet before the tree line. There were no footprints, no disturbance of the fresh snow, but the sound persisted, a soft crunching as if someone, or something, was moving carefully through the drifts. David tried to reassure her. "It's probably just the wind or a branch falling," he said, though his own voice lacked conviction. Soon the sound of footsteps grew closer, circling the cabin. Ethan pressed his face against his mother's arm while staring wide-eyed at the windows. Then came the scratching, light at first like a branch scraping glass, but soon it became more insistent, moving across the walls and roof with deliberate precision. David grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the door. The beam cut through the darkness outside, landing on a swirl of falling snow, but no person, no animal. Then he noticed something impossible. The snow outside had begun to shift, forming shapes that seemed almost humanoid. Shadows in the snow moved independently, curling toward the cabin as if drawn by some unseen force. Karen tried to calm the children, but the tension was building too fast. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, broken only by the pale moonlight streaming through frosted windows. Then came the voice, a whisper, low and guttural. "Come outside." The family froze. It sounded like it came from everywhere at once, surrounding them. Lily clutched her doll and Ethan whimpered into his mother's side. David, heart-pounding, moved to the breaker box, but the lights refused to return. As he stepped back, he saw the reflection in the window. A figure standing behind them in the room, tall, thin, featureless except for dark hollows where eyes should have been. When he spun around, there was nothing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in strange rhythms. "Play with us. Join us." The words made no sense, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening, hungry, patient. David tried calling 911, but the phone lines were dead. The cell signal was gone, as if the forest had swallowed it entirely. Panic surged. He grabbed a fire poker and held it in front of him, willing himself to stay calm. Karen held the children close, trying to shield them, while the sounds outside grew louder. Footsteps circling the cabin, dragging, scraping, stopping suddenly, then resuming again. Then the front door shook violently, as though someone or something was trying to force its way in. David braced himself, swinging the poker at the door as the knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The cabin groaned, the floorboards creaking under some invisible weight. Lily whispered, voice trembling, "It wants the tree." David turned to see the small pine tree in the corner of the living room quivering, ornaments rattling. The lights on it, though powerless, flickered faintly, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the tree itself. Then the ornaments began to twist, morphing into tiny, grotesque faces, mouths opening and closing as if screaming silently. Ethan screamed, and the tree's top branch whipped toward him, narrowly missing his face. David swung the poker again, hitting the branch, which recoiled as though alive. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and twisted, forming shapes that resembled elongated hands reaching toward the family. Desperate, David grabbed his family and tried to flee to the back door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they pushed, the door refused to open. The windows, too, were suddenly impossible to break, the glass unnaturally thick and cold. The cabin had become a cage, and whatever was outside had claimed it. From the corner of the living room, a dark shape began to coalesce. Taller than any man, its form flickering in and out of existence, it seemed to watch, patient, intelligent, waiting for fear to take root. The whispers became screams, overlapping voices, each one trying to penetrate their minds. "You belong here. You belong here." David tried to shield his family, but Lily ran toward the tree, drawn by the impossible pull of the entity outside and inside the cabin. He grabbed her just in time, but the momentary lapse allowed the shadows to surge closer, reaching their arms, pale, clawed, impossibly long, toward them. The cabin itself seemed alive. The walls stretched and warped, hallways elongating into impossible shapes, doors leading to empty voids where the floor should have been. The family clung to one another, trying to navigate through the nightmare. Time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours, and hours like seconds. Finally, in the corner of the room, David noticed a small wooden box that had not been there before. It was old, carved with symbols that burned themselves into his mind, indecipherable yet deeply familiar. The box rattled as if something inside it wanted out. David realized, with dawning horror, that it had drawn the creature's attention, and the shadows seemed to hesitate, circling the box. Summoning every ounce of courage, David grabbed the box and threw it into the fireplace. Flames roared unnaturally high, consuming the wood and symbols. The cabin shook violently, and the shadows recoiled with piercing screams. For a brief moment, silence fell, thick and suffocating. When the family dared to move again, the cabin appeared normal. The tree, though slightly askew, looked as it should, and the shadows were gone. The snow outside returned to its soft, silent fall, undisturbed. The only evidence of the nightmare was the lingering chill in the air, the scent of something charred and acrid, and the pounding of their hearts. The Thompsons left Ashford the next morning, not looking back. They never returned to that cabin. Over the years, neighbors reported strange occurrences, footprints appearing in the snow around the abandoned cabin, lights flickering inside when no one was there, and most chillingly, whispers heard on cold winter nights. Some say the entity that haunted the cabin is drawn to family homes at Christmas, feeding on hope and fear in equal measure. Others claim it was a spirit trapped in the forest, bound by old rituals long forgotten. Whatever it was, those who had encountered it knew the truth. It was patient, intelligent, and it never truly left. Even today, every winter, travelers report strange shadows among the pines, figures glimpsed in the corner of their eyes, whispers on the wind that sound like children calling for help. Ashford remains a quiet town, picturesque in the snow, but the locals know better. They know that Christmas Eve carries with it the memory of the Thompson family's terror, a reminder that not all holidays are safe, and not all traditions bring joy. Some nights, when the wind howls just right and the snow drifts silently, people swear they can hear the faintest sound of laughter turning into screams, echoing from the old forest near Ashford, waiting for the next family foolish enough to think they could spend Christmas there. Story the end. The winter of 2018 was unusually harsh in upstate New York. Snow began falling in early December, coating the small town of Cedarville in a heavy, relentless white. Streets disappeared under the snow, trees sagged under frozen weight, and a bitter wind howled through alleyways and empty lots. For most residents, it was the kind of Christmas that belonged in postcards, the type you might remember fondly. But for the Miller family, that season would become a nightmare that they could never forget. David Miller, a 40-year-old firefighter, had spent the day decorating their home on Maple Street. His wife, Sarah, had baked gingerbread cookies with their two children, Ellie, aged 8, and Ben, aged 5. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine, lights twinkled on the tree, and the warmth of the fireplace made the room feel cozy despite the icy cold outside. Everything looked perfect. Or at least, that's how it started. Around 6 p.m., the lights flickered once, then twice, and then went out entirely. David cursed under his breath. The storm must have taken down a line, he said, though there was a subtle unease in his tone. He grabbed his phone to check for outages, but noticed the signal was gone. The TV was dead, the radio silent. Only the storm outside remained, fierce and unrelenting. David decided to check the perimeter of the house. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked toward the driveway, and that's when he noticed something strange. Footprints in the fresh snow. At first, they seemed human, but the spacing was uneven, the steps too long, almost deliberate. They led directly to the front porch and stopped there. David frowned. No one should be out in this storm. Inside, Sarah was trying to calm the children, who had grown nervous as shadows flickered against the walls from the dim light of the fireplace. That's when the first knock came. Soft, deliberate, at the front door. David froze. "I'll check," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Through the peephole, he saw nothing, just the snow blowing in tight, twisting patterns. He opened the door, but the porch was empty, only the footprints in the snow, leading from nowhere, ending abruptly at the doorstep. By 8 p.m., the unease had grown unbearable. Ellie swore she saw someone outside the window, tall and thin, standing perfectly still in the snow, but every time David rushed over to check, no one was there. Ben clung to Sarah, whispering that the man with no eyes was staring at him from the yard. David laughed it off nervously, though even he couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. Dinner was silent. The snowstorm had worsened, drifts piling up against the doors, the wind howling like a chorus of wolves. Then the scratching began. At first it was faint, barely audible over the storm, like nails dragging across wood, but it grew louder, coming from the attic, the walls, the roof, everywhere at once. The children screamed, and even Sarah's voice shook when she tried to calm them. David grabbed a flashlight and headed to the basement, the only part of the house with direct outside access. As he descended the stairs, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed on the concrete walls, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. At the far corner, something moved. A shadow, thin and unnaturally tall, with no discernible features, shifted just out of the light's reach. David froze. The figure didn't walk or run. It glided, its motion smooth and deliberate, and then a whisper filled the room. Not through the air, but inside his head. "You shouldn't be here." David stumbled back, nearly falling, and the figure disappeared. Heart pounding, he slammed the basement door shut and barricaded it with a chair. Upstairs, Sarah had gathered the children in the living room, trying to block out the storm and the sounds with blankets and soft voices. But the scratching didn't stop, and the whispering had grown, overlapping into a cacophony of voices calling their names, promising, threatening, mocking. At midnight, the storm reached its peak. The power returned briefly, flickering on long enough for the family to glimpse a figure outside the living room window. It was tall, impossibly thin, and featureless, pressed against the glass. The snow swirled around it, hiding details, but the sense of menace was palpable. Its hands left dark smears on the window. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, it whispered, "Open the door." David's hand shook as he reached for a poker. "No," he shouted, but the voice continued, relentless. The shadows inside the house began to shift, stretching unnaturally along walls and across floors, almost alive, almost waiting. The basement door burst open on its own, and a cold gust filled the room, carrying the faint scent of decay. The family retreated to the master bedroom. They barricaded the door with furniture, huddling together under blankets. The shadows seemed to linger at the edges of the room, flickering in the corners. Time fractured. Minutes stretched into hours. Outside, the snowstorm raged, but inside a different storm had begun, one of fear, whispers, and creeping darkness. Morning came finally, pale and gray. The snow had stopped, the storm abated, and the world outside looked untouched. No footprints led away from the house. No evidence remained of the night's horrors. But inside, the Miller family knew better. Ellie refused to sleep alone, muttering about the faceless man in the snow. Ben avoided the basement entirely, and David and Sarah stayed awake for days, watching, listening, afraid to blink. The years that followed brought no relief. Every Christmas, the whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder, scratching at doors and windows, moving objects when no one was looking. The children's sleep was haunted by visions of tall, faceless figures in the snow outside, and David swore he could hear the faint echo of the voice telling them to open the door. They moved houses eventually, hoping distance would sever the connection. But no matter where they went, the presence followed. Shadows appeared in rooms with no light, footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and that same whisper, insistent, cold, patient, found them every year at Christmas. David learned the hard truth. Some things are patient, some things wait, and some things, once they've chosen you, never leave. The Miller family never celebrated Christmas the way they used to. No tree, no lights, no baking, just the quiet vigil, waiting for the whispers, for the scratching, for the faceless figure in the snow to return. And every year, without fail, it did, patient and relentless, reminding them that some horrors do not end with the night. Even now, long after they moved to a warmer state, David can feel the weight of that winter pressing on him every December. He knows the storm will come, and with it the faceless man, waiting for the moment someone dares to open the door. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of town where everyone knew each other's business, and the streets were lined with snow-covered pines and flickering porch lights. The Hayes family had spent the day preparing for the holiday. Daniel Hayes, a high school history teacher, had spent the morning putting up lights on their modest home, while his wife Rebecca baked pies and cookies, filling the house with the warm, sweet smell of cinnamon and sugar. Their 2 children, 8-year-old Mia and 6-year-old Noah, were upstairs, bouncing with excitement as they debated which presents they might open first in the morning. By nightfall, the snow was falling steadily, blanketing the streets and muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. The Hayes' house sat on the edge of a small cul-de-sac, the last home before the forest began, dark and dense even under the full moon. Daniel glanced out the window, admiring the lights on the house across the street when something caught his eye, a shadow moving quickly at the edge of the woods behind their house. He rubbed his eyes, certain it was just his imagination, but the shadow moved again, quicker this time, as if it had noticed him watching. Rebecca called him to the kitchen. "Dinner's ready," she said cheerfully, unaware of the uneasy feeling settling over him. Daniel shrugged it off, but the unease didn't fade. The family sat down to eat, laughter and chatter filling the room. Yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them from the trees behind their house. He tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the shadows. Around 9 o'clock, a knock echoed through the house. At first, Daniel thought it was the wind, but the knock came again, deliberate and steady, at the back door. He exchanged a glance with Rebecca. "I'll check it," he said, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. Opening the door, he found nothing but snow and darkness. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. He closed the door, shaken, and locked it. The storm outside had picked up, and the wind howled through the trees, making the house groan and creak in response. The children were already in bed by then, whispering to each other about Santa Claus and whether he would visit early. Daniel and Rebecca tried to watch a Christmas movie to distract themselves, but every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, made Daniel tense. Then the power flickered. First once, then twice, then went out entirely. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the glow of the tree lights. That's when they heard it. A faint scraping, like fingernails on wood, coming from the kitchen. Daniel grabbed the flashlight he kept on the counter and crept toward the sound. The scraping stopped as he entered the kitchen. Nothing. The chairs were in place, the counters clear, yet the smell of something metallic lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. Rebecca joined him, clutching a rolling pin. "It's probably just the storm," she said, though her voice trembled. Daniel shook his head, feeling a cold sweat. The wind outside intensified, rattling the windows violently. Then a low, guttural moan emanated from the basement. Daniel's heart raced. He had no reason to be in the basement, but curiosity and fear pushed him to investigate. He grabbed the flashlight and descended slowly. The basement was cold, damp, and empty. Shelves of tools and boxes cast long shadows in the beam of the flashlight. Then he saw it. Handprints smeared on the dusty floor, large, elongated, impossibly human-like, yet wrong. Some prints were upside down, as if someone had walked on their hands, or had been dragged across the floor backward. He ran back upstairs, pale and shaking. Rebecca grabbed his arm. "Daniel, what did you see?" He couldn't explain it. Someone, or something, was down there, handprints on the floor. Suddenly, the children screamed. They had woken up and were pointing at the windows. Daniel rushed to the room and saw a figure standing outside, just beyond the frost-covered glass. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its face hidden under the shadow of a hood or perhaps a mask. Its eyes, if they could be called that, reflected the tree lights, bright and cold. Daniel ran to the back door and threw it open. The figure was gone, vanished into the snow, leaving only footprints that led into the woods and disappeared into the darkness. The family huddled together in the living room, too terrified to sleep. Hours passed, with the wind howling outside and the faintest whispers reaching them through the walls, like 100 voices layered over each other, pleading, warning, or laughing. It was impossible to tell. Morning came slowly. When Daniel finally stepped outside to survey the scene, he was met with a chilling sight. The snow around the house was marked with more footprints, enormous and twisted, circling the house repeatedly before vanishing into the forest. Oddly, some of the prints appeared to be moving backward, walking in reverse without explanation. The police were called, though nothing could be found beyond the strange tracks in the snow. They promised to patrol the area, but the Hayes family knew that whatever had come to their home wasn't likely to be caught or even understood. Christmas Day was subdued. The children stayed indoors, clinging to their parents. Every shadow, every creak of the old house reminded them of the terror from the night before. Neighbors whispered of similar sightings in the woods surrounding the town, figures glimpsed in the snow, strange lights moving in the trees, and sounds that didn't belong to any animal. In the weeks that followed, the Hayes family noticed strange occurrences that couldn't be explained. Objects moved on their own, doors would lock and unlock, and every winter, around Christmas, the smell of iron returned, faint and horrifying. Daniel and Rebecca moved once, hoping to escape, but the phenomenon followed them. Footprints appeared outside their new home, scratches on walls, and the occasional glimpse of a shadowy figure outside the window. Years later, Daniel still wakes on Christmas Eve to the sound of tapping at the windows and faint whispers in the wind. Every year, without fail, footprints appear in the snow outside, circling the house and disappearing into the woods. The family no longer leaves the lights on at night, no longer invites neighbors in, no longer speaks of the figure for fear it might hear them. The children grew up with a healthy fear of the woods behind their home. They never venture out after dark in winter, always aware of the possibility that the figure could return. Even now, long after that first night, Daniel feels it watching him, waiting, patient. Every gust of wind, every creak of the old house reminds him of that Christmas Eve when they were not alone, when something otherworldly came into their home, leaving behind footprints, whispers, and a terror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And every Christmas Eve, as the wind blows and the snow falls, Daniel checks the windows, flashlight in hand, rifle at the ready, knowing that the figure is out there somewhere, always watching, always counting down until it returns. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in the quiet town of Pine Ridge, a small community nestled in the mountains of Vermont. Snow had been falling for most of the day, covering rooftops and streets with a thick, silent blanket of white. The streets were nearly empty. Most people had retreated to the warmth of their homes, preparing for family gatherings or last-minute celebrations. But in one modest house on Willow Lane, the Thomas family's Christmas was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. Claire Thomas had spent the day bustling in the kitchen, preparing a feast for her husband, David, and their 2 children, Lily and Ben. The house was fragrant with the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and pine from the small tree in the corner of the living room. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the occasional scraping of snow against the windows. It was beautiful, festive, but there was an undercurrent of unease Claire couldn't shake. She chalked it up to fatigue. After a 12-hour shift at the hospital, exhaustion made shadows look darker and sounds sharper. David was in the living room, adjusting the Christmas lights and teasing Lily and Ben with playful snowball fights using small indoor snow toys. Everything appeared normal, cheerful even. But Claire noticed something strange as she glanced toward the kitchen window. A figure standing at the edge of their yard, just beyond the glow of the porch light. At first, she thought it might be a neighbor, someone braving the snowstorm. But as she watched, the figure didn't move, didn't react to the falling snow. It was tall, dressed in dark clothes and completely still, almost impossibly still. "David," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is someone out there?" David glanced over, squinting. "What? Out where?" "There, by the trees," she said, pointing. David laughed lightly. "It's probably just a shadow. Snowstorm's playing tricks on you." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling. The figure didn't belong, didn't move like a person. And then it disappeared. Just like that, vanishing into the snow as if it had never been there. By dinner, Claire was on edge. She tried to focus on her family, serving the children their plates and keeping up small talk, but she kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the figure again. She didn't. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold presence she couldn't shake. After dinner, they gathered by the tree to open presents. The children were joyful, laughing and tearing through wrapping paper, but Claire's attention kept drifting to the windows, the dark shadows outside. As the evening wore on, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the roof. Then came the first sound she couldn't explain, a knock at the front door. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind. Claire froze, heart racing. David, thinking it was someone from a neighboring house caught in the storm, got up to check. He opened the door, flashlight in hand. Snow had been blown across the porch, but there was no one there, not even footprints. "Probably just the wind," David said, closing the door. Claire wanted to believe him, but her instincts screamed otherwise. Hours later, after the kids had gone to bed, the unease returned with a vengeance. Claire was sitting in the living room, cleaning up, when she heard it. A soft scratching sound at the kitchen window. She jumped up and shined the flashlight toward it. Nothing. The yard was empty, except for the heavy snow. The trees swayed in the wind, shadows flickering across the yard, but there was no figure. Then came the tapping, slow, deliberate, coming from the roof. It started at the peak and worked its way down, like something was walking across the shingles. Claire froze, listening. The sound stopped abruptly, then started again, this time closer, near the chimney. Her breath caught. David, still downstairs, didn't hear it, or pretended not to. She wanted to call out, but the words stuck in her throat. The next hour was a blur of fear. The tapping continued intermittently, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Claire wasn't sure if she was imagining them, but the air in the room felt charged, oppressive. She decided to check on the kids, reassuring herself they were safe. Their door was closed, the room dark, and the children were asleep, murmuring in their dreams. But the sense of something wrong didn't fade. Around midnight, David returned from a quick check of the perimeter, dismissing her fears again. But as they sat together, trying to calm themselves, the lights flickered. Then went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, lit only by the storm's muted glow through the windows. Claire lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows that danced across the walls. And that's when she saw it. A shadow outside the kitchen window, impossibly tall and unnaturally still. Its face was obscured by darkness, but the shape alone was enough to make her blood run cold. "David," she whispered, voice trembling. He turned just in time to see it too. The figure raised one long arm, slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging their presence. Then it vanished, as though swallowed by the snowstorm itself. By 2 a.m., the family was huddled in the living room, barricading themselves with chairs and holding makeshift weapons, kitchen knives, a baseball bat. The sound of footsteps outside grew heavier, moving around the house, circling them. Scratches appeared on the door frames, small but deep, as though something sharp had tried to get in. The children cried softly, holding on to their parents, and Claire prayed silently that it would go away. Then the front door slowly creaked open. A gust of freezing wind swept into the house. Claire screamed, grabbing David's arm. They saw nothing at first, just the doorway swinging slightly, snow blowing in. But then they noticed the footprints, large, heavy, unnatural, leading from the porch across the living room carpet and stopping abruptly in front of the tree. No one was there. The prints didn't lead back outside. Claire sank to the floor, shaking, staring at the marks. David held her tightly, trying to reassure her, but even he was pale, tense, aware that something unexplainable had invaded their home. The rest of the night passed in agonizing silence, broken only by occasional thumps and the eerie sound of distant laughter, low and guttural, carried through the wind. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The snowstorm had stopped, leaving a stark, silent world outside. Claire ventured out to inspect the yard. The snow was pristine except for one trail of footprints leading from the woods to the porch, and then stopping abruptly as if the figure had vanished into thin air. There were no tracks leading away. It was as though it had walked through dimensions, appearing and disappearing at will. Over the next week, the family tried to move past the event, but nothing felt normal. The kids refused to sleep in their rooms, claiming the man would be watching. Objects moved inexplicably around the house. Doors opened and closed on their own. Claire swore she heard whispers when she was alone, calling her name softly, but in voices she didn't recognize. By Christmas of the next year, the story of the Thomas family had spread through Pine Ridge. Neighbors told similar tales, shadowy figures appearing in yards during storms, strange scratches on doors, whispering voices in the wind. No one could explain it, and authorities dismissed the incidents as coincidence or imagination. But Claire knew better. The figure had chosen them once, and it hadn't left. Every year, when the first snow falls, Claire feels the presence again. She catches glimpses of the tall shadow at the edge of the yard, or sees the flicker of movement through the frosted windows. She doesn't leave the house alone during storms, and the children, now older, refuse to come home for the holidays. Every Christmas carries the memory of that night, the tapping, the whispers, the unnatural footsteps, and the shadow that watched, waited, and vanished without a trace. Somehow the town went on, celebrating the holidays in cheer and light. But for the Thomas family, Christmas is a reminder that some things are not meant to be seen in daylight, and some horrors only arrive when the world is silent, snowy, and still. The figure, whatever it was, remains a lingering threat, a dark presence that has chosen them and continues to return every winter, patient, silent, and unyielding. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Pine Ridge, Massachusetts, a place where snow blanketed the streets and the smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air. Most houses glimmered with lights, and families were bustling with last-minute preparations, but on the outskirts of town, the Holloway house stood unusually dark. The Victorian home had been empty for nearly a decade, the paint peeling, windows clouded with dust, and rumors about the previous owners whispered among locals. Nobody went near it, especially during winter, when the long shadows of the trees cast strange shapes across the yard. This year, the house was sold to a young couple, Eric and Melissa Turner, who had moved from Boston looking for a fresh start. They were drawn to the historic charm of the Holloway home, despite its reputation. The first day of moving in had been exhausting, and as night fell on Christmas Eve, the snowstorm outside made the house feel even colder than it already was. Eric lit the fireplace in the living room while Melissa unpacked boxes in the kitchen. Their two children, 12-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Lucas, ran around exploring the rooms, laughing and playing. At first, everything seemed normal, but then Melissa noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, she thought Emma or Lucas were exploring, but when she called out, the house fell silent. She frowned and told herself it was the settling of the old house, the kind of creaks and groans older homes made in winter. Later, as the family decorated the Christmas tree, Eric noticed a shadow moving across the hallway. He paused, squinting, but the hall was empty. Probably just the lights playing tricks, he said, though he couldn't shake a creeping feeling of unease. As night deepened, strange things began to happen. Doors that had been closed earlier were now slightly ajar, ornaments that had been placed carefully on the tree were scattered across the floor, and the children complained of hearing whispers in the house. It's Santa! Lucas said excitedly, but his voice held an edge of fear that made Melissa's stomach twist. By 11 p.m., the unease turned into terror. The house seemed to breathe, the air thick with cold, and every shadow appeared alive. Emma swore she saw a figure in her bedroom doorway, tall and thin, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. She screamed, and Eric ran to her room, but when he turned on the light, nothing was there. Melissa tried to calm the children, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate jingling, like sleigh bells, echoing through the house. It wasn't the cheerful tinkle of Christmas music. It was dragging, harsh, irregular, and it came from upstairs. The family froze. The sound stopped, then started again, closer, circling the rooms as if something or someone was pacing just out of sight. Eric grabbed a flashlight and tried to check the upstairs hallway, but as he stepped onto the landing, the lights flickered, and the house shook slightly, as though it were alive. The children clung to Melissa, sobbing. A whisper followed them down the stairs, low and guttural, unintelligible, but filled with malice. "Who's there? Show yourself!" Eric shouted, but the house remained empty, shadows twisting unnaturally in the flickering light. Then the fireplace erupted, flames shooting higher than before, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. The Christmas tree toppled, ornaments shattering across the floor. Melissa grabbed the kids and tried to reach the front door, but it was stuck, locked tight. The windows wouldn't budge. Outside, the wind howled, but Eric was certain he could hear footsteps on the porch, circling, slow and deliberate. And then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the glass. Tall, thin, impossible posture, with long limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but when it tilted its head, a faint, horrifying smile stretched across where its mouth should have been. The figure glided, not walked, across the front yard, stopping at every window, peering in. The family screamed, huddling together, but the being didn't enter. Instead, it left something behind, a single crudely wrapped gift on the living room floor. Eric picked it up, his hands shaking. The paper was rough, the string like dried sinew, and the tag read in jagged letters, "Merry Christmas." "We've been watching." Suddenly the whispering intensified, echoing from every corner of the house. The children screamed as shadows began to stretch and twist unnaturally around them. Eric swung the flashlight, trying to catch the figure, but the light passed through it as if it were mist. Melissa grabbed a heavy pan and struck at it. Nothing but cold air met her swing. Panic took over. The family tried everything, pounding on doors, shouting, praying, but the house responded with more chaos. Cabinets flew open, the chandelier swung violently, and a deafening crash came from the attic. The figure's voice joined the whispers, low and rasping. All gifts must be unwrapped, all secrets revealed. Eric remembered an old journal he had found in the attic weeks earlier, belonging to the previous owner, Jonathan Holloway. The entries spoke of a watcher, a spirit that came every Christmas to punish those who carried secrets, feeding on fear, demanding honesty, and punishing those who lied or hid the truth. Eric's heart pounded. The journal was not a story, it was a warning. Desperate, Eric began confessing aloud, naming every small secret, mistake, or lie he could think of, hoping to appease whatever haunted them. Melissa and the children joined, sobbing, speaking truths they'd never shared. The whispers slowed, the atmosphere changed, as if the house were listening, evaluating. Hours passed in trembling silence. The fireplace dimmed, the shadows withdrew, and the front door unlocked itself. The jingling ceased. The house was calm again, eerily so, the chaos gone as if it had never happened. The family didn't hesitate. They grabbed coats, blankets, and left, driving through the storm to stay with relatives for the rest of Christmas. When they returned days later, the Holloway house appeared abandoned once more. No footprints, no broken ornaments, no sign of forced entry, only the lingering smell of burned pine and a single sleigh bell lying on the living room floor, tarnished and cold. The family never returned to spend another Christmas there. Over the years, the Turners told few people what happened. Friends suggested stress, an overactive imagination, or old houses settling. But Emma and Lucas never forgot. Every Christmas Eve, even as adults, they would wake with the same cold dread, the same feeling of being watched, the faint jingling in the distance. Eric and Melissa never decorated the house again, and the memory of that night haunted them every holiday season. Locals still whisper about the Holloway house. Some claim to see faint lights flickering behind the dusty windows or shadows moving unnaturally on winter nights. Others swear they hear the same dragging, irregular jingling of bells that the Turners did, a sound that seems to circle the house, promising that the watcher is still there, waiting for the next family to bring their secrets inside. Pine Ridge goes about its holiday celebrations, but those who know the story avoid the Holloway house, leaving it untouched, the snow piling high against its walls. And every Christmas Eve, some claim a tall, thin figure glides just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting, ensuring that all gifts are claimed and all secrets are revealed. Families whisper warnings to their children. Never touch the house, never peek through the windows, never ignore the feeling of being watched. The Turners lived with the memory for the rest of their lives. Every holiday, the echo of whispers and the jingling of unseen bells reminded them that some gifts are never meant to be opened, some secrets never safely kept, and some visitors never truly leave. Story, the end. The snow was falling harder than I'd ever seen that Christmas Eve. I had driven from Boston up to the mountains of New Hampshire to spend the holiday with my brother, Mark, and his family. They lived in a large, rustic cabin on the edge of the forest outside a tiny town called Dalton. The road had been treacherous, ice beneath the snow, nearly invisible, and at least 3 times I thought my car was going to skid off into the pines. But I made it just before dark, headlights cutting through the storm, illuminating the white wilderness like a tunnel of snow and shadow. Mark was waiting on the porch, bundled in layers, his breath puffing out in clouds. "Finally," he said, waving me over. His wife, Claire, appeared behind him, a flashlight in hand. Their kids, Emma and Jake, were bouncing up and down in the snow, not really feeling the danger of the storm. "You're crazy driving in this," Claire scolded gently, pulling me into the cabin. We were starting to worry. The cabin was warm, lit by the fire and strings of Christmas lights. The smell of pine and cinnamon filled the air, mixed with the faint tang of wood smoke from the fireplace. The kids ran to their rooms to continue playing with the toys they had gotten from last year's gifts, and Mark handed me a beer. We sat in the living room, the snow beating against the windows, and tried to make the evening feel normal. But there was an unease in the cabin, a heaviness that I couldn't place. Mark noticed it too. "The storm's strong," he said. "Almost too strong. Makes you feel like the woods are closing in on us." I laughed it off. "You've been watching too many Christmas horror movies." By 10 p.m., the storm had intensified. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving us in near darkness, the only light coming from the fire. We lit some candles and tried to settle in, playing board games and telling stories to distract the kids. But even the warmth of the fire couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Around midnight, as Emma and Jake were asleep, Mark and I went outside to check the woodpile for more logs. The snow was so deep that we left clear boot tracks that disappeared behind us almost as fast as we made them. The forest was silent, eerily so, except for the occasional creak of a tree under the weight of snow. "Feels wrong," I said, rubbing my hands together, "like something's watching." Mark nodded. "I know. You ever feel that? Like the woods are alive at night?" I laughed nervously. "Yeah, sure. Totally normal." We hauled the last of the firewood inside and secured the doors, but the feeling lingered. By 1 a.m., Mark had gone to bed, leaving me alone in the living room to watch over the fire. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was Mark or Claire moving around upstairs, but the steps were too slow, too heavy, deliberate. They weren't on the hardwood floors inside the cabin. They were coming from outside. I froze, straining to hear over the roar of the wind. Then I heard a tap at the window, a single slow tap, like a branch against the glass. My stomach sank. The wind had to be moving branches, I told myself, but the tap came again. 3 slow, measured taps. Heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window. Outside, the snow was deep and undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading from the tree line toward the cabin. The prints were huge, far larger than Mark or mine, and the snow around them was undisturbed, as if they had appeared out of nowhere. I ran to wake Mark. He came downstairs, groggy and confused. Footprints? He asked. I pointed. They're huge. Someone's out there. He frowned and grabbed a rifle from the corner of the living room. Stay here, he said, and went outside, the snow crunching under his boots. I followed cautiously, keeping the flashlight trained on the tracks. Mark followed the prints to the edge of the forest. Then, just as suddenly as they began, the prints stopped. No sign of anyone. No broken branches, no footprints leading away. Nothing. Just snow and trees and the oppressive silence of the storm. We went back inside, shaken. The fire had died down, and the cabin felt colder than it had been before. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, just beyond the window, hidden in the darkness. By 3 a.m., I was wide awake, unable to sleep. I wandered the cabin, checking doors and windows. That's when I heard it again. The slow, deliberate footsteps, this time inside. They came from the hallway, near the kids' rooms. My heart thumped in my chest. Mark? I called softly. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and edged toward the hallway. The beam fell on the floor, and I saw them. Muddy footprints, same size as the ones outside, leading from the kids' rooms toward the living room. My blood ran cold. I froze, listening. Then a door creaked. One of the kids' bedroom doors was slightly open. I approached slowly, my hand on the doorknob. The room was empty, but the closet door at the far end was wide open, and inside, something moved. A shadow crouched there, dark and unmoving. I yelped, and it vanished in an instant, like it had never been there. The closet smelled of decay and something metallic. I ran to wake Mark, shaking him awake. He was confused but came with me to the room. We searched every corner. Nothing. The closet was empty, but on the floor, scattered around, were small trinkets, ornaments, and toys, things we hadn't brought with us, things that didn't belong to anyone in the cabin. Mark's face went pale. That's impossible, he said. How? Before I could answer, the wind outside howled, and the porch door slammed. We ran there and found it wide open, snow drifting in. There were footprints leading away from the cabin, large and disappearing into the forest. We called the police, but with the storm, no one could reach us. We barricaded the doors and waited, the storm howling outside, our nerves shredded. Every creak of the floorboards, every tap at the window made us jump. By morning, the storm had subsided, but the snow had buried the footprints. When the sheriff arrived, he found nothing. No sign of anyone, no forced entry, nothing out of place except the scattered ornaments and trinkets. He suggested it might have been a prank or hallucination due to stress, but Mark and I knew better. The photographs, the toys, the footprints, they were real, and they were deliberate. That Christmas, we left the cabin as quickly as possible. Mark moved away months later, trying to escape whatever had haunted us. I never returned. Every Christmas Eve since, I hear it in my dreams. The footsteps, the taps at the window, the feeling of being watched. I never leave the doors unlocked anymore. I never let my guard down in the snow. Because I know, deep down, that whatever it was out there, in the storm and the woods, it's still waiting. Waiting for the next cabin, the next family, the next Christmas night when someone thinks they're safe. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right and the snow is falling thick, I swear I can hear 3 slow, deliberate taps at my window. Story the end. The snow was falling hard in the small town of Pine Ridge, Ohio, blanketing the streets in thick, wet flakes that clung to every tree and lamppost. The town's Christmas decorations glimmered under the heavy snowfall, wreaths and lights giving an eerie warmth to the otherwise silent streets. For the Johnson family, this was supposed to be the perfect Christmas. Mike Johnson, a 38-year-old paramedic, and his wife Karen, 35, had spent weeks preparing for the holiday. Their 2 children, 9-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Luke, had helped decorate the house with handmade ornaments and strings of lights. Outside, a small snowman stood in the front yard, its coal eyes glinting in the flickering glow of the porch light. By late afternoon, the storm had intensified. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees, shaking their branches like skeletal arms. Mike had just finished hanging the last ornament on the Christmas tree when he noticed something odd through the living room window. Footprints in the fresh snow led up to the porch, but they didn't appear to belong to anyone in the neighborhood. They were long, wide, and oddly spaced, as if whoever or whatever had made them was unnaturally tall. Karen, sensing her husband's unease, peered out the window. Maybe it's just someone walking their dog, she suggested. though her voice lacked conviction. Mike shook his head. "No dog leaves footprints like that," he muttered. The children, oblivious to the tension, continued hanging ornaments and laughing, their innocence a fragile shield against the creeping dread that had begun to settle in the room. By 7 p.m., dinner was ready. The family gathered around the table, but the storm outside made the house feel claustrophobic. The lights flickered once, then twice, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. Luke shivered, pulling his blanket tighter around him. "Mom, Dad, I hear someone outside," he whispered. Karen forced a smile and reassured him that it was probably the wind. Mike, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from beyond the snow-laden yard. After dinner, the family moved to the living room for presents. Emma tore through the paper with glee, revealing books and toys she had been hoping for. Luke received a model train, his eyes wide with excitement. But the festive atmosphere was shattered when the first knock came at the door. One slow, deliberate knock. Then a pause. Then 3 more. Mike froze. "Who's there?" he called, his voice tense. No answer, just the sound of the storm pressing against the house. Karen held the children close, her heart racing. The knocking continued, now joined by a scratching sound along the doorframe, as if someone or something was testing the wood. Mike grabbed a flashlight and peered through the peephole. Nothing. No figure. Just snow swirling in the wind. "Probably a branch," he said, though even as he spoke, the rational explanation felt hollow. He barricaded the door with a chair, just in case. The children huddled close to their parents on the couch, the trees' colored lights casting flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Around 9 p.m., the whispers began. Soft at first, like the wind passing through the eaves, but gradually forming words that chilled Mike to the bone. "Come out! We see you! Open the door!" The family froze. The voices didn't sound human, yet they were intelligible, insistent. Mike grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, his hands shaking. "Stay close," he whispered, trying to keep calm for the children's sake. The storm raged on outside, snow piling higher against the windows. Then, without warning, the lights went out completely. Darkness engulfed the house, leaving only the dim glow of the Christmas tree. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. Mike tried to call the police, but every phone line was dead. Even the cell signal had vanished, swallowed by the storm. Emma clutched her mother, tears streaming down her face. Luke whimpered, pressing his small body against his father. The air in the house felt heavier, almost solid, as if the storm had seeped inside with the shadows. Mike shined his flashlight around the room and froze. On the living room wall, the shadows were no longer cast by the tree or the furniture. They moved independently, twisting and stretching in impossible ways. Then came the sound of footsteps in the hallway, deliberate, slow, and echoing against the walls. Mike aimed the flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing. The house was empty, or so it seemed. The whispers were now joined by a low, guttural humming vibrating through the floorboards and walls. Hours passed. Exhaustion and fear blurred reality. Mike and Karen held the children, rocking them, whispering reassurances they didn't fully believe. Every creak of the house, every groan of the wind outside made them flinch. The shadows seemed to gather at the edges of their vision, vanishing when looked at directly but always returning, closer each time. By midnight, the storm outside had lessened slightly. Mike, desperate for any sign of normalcy, ventured toward the front door. The snow-covered porch looked untouched, no footprints leading away, no sign of who had been knocking or scratching. The yard was empty, silent except for the gentle fall of snow. He let out a shaky breath and returned inside, only to find the living room in disarray. The tree was toppled, ornaments shattered across the floor, and the nativity set had been knocked over, figures broken. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Mike called out for the children. Karen screamed. They were gone. No sign of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading outside. Just gone. Panic surged through him. He searched every room, every closet, every corner of the house. Nothing. By dawn, the neighbors began to notice something was wrong. Lights in the house were still off, and the usually cheerful Christmas music had not played. Concerned, they called the police. Officers arrived to find the house in chaos. Furniture overturned, ornaments smashed, decorations torn from the walls, but there were no signs of the Johnson family. No footprints in the snow leading away. No clues, only a lingering sense of dread that seemed to permeate the home itself. Weeks later, the house remained abandoned. Locals avoided it, whispering stories of strange happenings on Christmas Eve. Some claimed to see shadows moving behind the boarded-up windows or lights flickering as if someone were inside. Others said they could hear faint whispering when the wind blew just right, voices calling out, insistent and hollow. Every year around Christmas, people in Pine Ridge reported similar phenomena near the Johnson house. Footprints in the snow that appeared overnight, unexplainable cold spots, doors opening and closing on their own. The legend grew, a warning that some holidays are not meant for joy, that some nights harbor something far older and far darker than anyone could imagine. And so the house stands, silent in the snow, waiting for the next family to discover that Christmas can bring more than gifts and warmth, that it can bring terror and take those you love, leaving only emptiness behind. Story the end. It was the kind of December in upstate New York that made everything feel isolated and frozen in time. Snow had been falling steadily for days, piling up along the roads and burying the sidewalks under thick white drifts. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, rattling branches against the roof of the old farmhouse on the outskirts of Millstone County. For the Reynolds family, this Christmas was supposed to be perfect, a rare reunion of extended family with laughter, gifts, and warm food after a long year. Julia Reynolds had driven the 6 hours from Albany with her 2 children, Michael, 8, and Lily, 5. Her parents, Carl and Denise Reynolds, had spent the morning decorating the living room, hanging stockings on the fireplace and draping garlands along the stair rails. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, and the aroma of roasting turkey drifted from the kitchen. It was picturesque. Yet, as Julia unpacked the car and carried boxes of gifts to the living room, she couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. Something about the house felt off. Not in the creaky, old house way, but in a way that made her skin crawl. The air was too cold, even with the heat running, and shadows seemed to cling unnaturally to the corners of every room. She dismissed it as stress, telling herself she was imagining things. Her father, Carl, noticed her hesitation. "It's just the wind," he said, patting her shoulder. "This house is old. It makes noises. You'll get used to it." Dinner was a cheerful affair. Plates piled with turkey, mashed potatoes, and green beans, laughter spilling around the table. Michael and Lily were fascinated by the old grandfather clock in the hallway, which ticked loudly enough to fill the silence between bites. But as night fell, the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows with an almost deliberate force. By the time Julia sent the children to bed, she felt a tension in the air she couldn't explain. Carl and Denise settled into the living room to open a bottle of wine, but the atmosphere was thick, suffocating, as if the storm outside had seeped into the walls. The shadows of the room seemed deeper, darker, shifting slightly when they weren't looking. It was just past midnight when the first noise came, a slow, scraping sound from the back of the house. Julia woke suddenly, heart racing, thinking she had imagined it. Then it came again, louder, deliberate. Carl rose to investigate, telling Denise to stay put. The hallway stretched dark before him, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. He reached the back door and shone the light onto the snow-covered porch. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there, just the swirling snow and the weight of the storm. He turned back toward the living room, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing just inside the doorway between the kitchen and hallway. Its shape was tall and thin, hooded, features obscured. It didn't move at first, just lingered, almost as if it had been waiting. Carl froze, heart hammering. "Who's there?" he called, voice tight. The figure didn't respond. It just tilted its head, an unnatural angle, and a low, garbled whisper reached his ears. "You forgot me." Denise screamed from the living room. Carl turned, and the figure was gone. By the time Julia reached the living room, the air felt icy, and the shadows were no longer in the corners. They were moving, wrapping around the furniture, flickering across the walls like living things. The family huddled together, listening as the sound of dragging footsteps echoed from the back of the house. The night stretched on in a nightmare of half-heard whispers and flickering candlelight. The power went out completely, leaving them in darkness except for the glow of the fireplace. The scratching and dragging continued, circling the house, coming closer to the bedrooms, then retreating, teasing them. Julia tried to reassure the children, but even Michael and Lily could sense it, their small faces pressed into her side, eyes wide with terror. "Mommy, it's coming back," Michael whispered. By dawn, the storm had subsided, but the damage had been done. The back door was wide open, the snow blown in, leaving wet footprints across the wooden floor. Heavy, irregular prints, dragging something behind it. Julia followed the tracks outside and realized they led into the woods that bordered the property, then disappeared abruptly, as if the creature had been snatched back into the trees. The family tried to rationalize it. A neighbor? A prank? But the signs were everywhere. Ornaments had been knocked off the tree, presents were moved or ripped open, replaced with broken dolls, rusted tools, or shards of glass. Even stranger, the grandfather clock had stopped at exactly 12:17 a.m., and it refused to start again. Over the next week, unease settled like a permanent fog over the house. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't. Soft whispers called names that no one had spoken. Doors that had been locked were found ajar, windows unlocked. The children refused to sleep alone, and Carl and Denise spent nights staring at the darkened hallways, listening. One evening, Julia found herself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. A cold breeze swept through, though all the windows were shut. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure, hunched and dark, slowly crossing the living room toward the stairwell. Heart pounding, she screamed for Carl, but when he arrived, it was gone. Only the sound of the wind in the trees outside remained. On Christmas Eve, the worst happened. The storm returned, heavier than before, snow so thick it obscured the roads and made the house feel like a frozen fortress. Candles flickered, and the shadows seemed to press inward. Julia had tucked the children into bed early, hoping to protect them, but she could hear soft scratching at the door, dragging along the walls, whispering in voices that weren't human. Then the figure appeared, stepping from the shadows, hooded, impossibly tall, dragging a broken, bloodied doll across the floor. Its face was pale, waxen, eyes hollow, yet burning with something that made Julia's stomach turn. It raised a hand slowly and pointed toward them. "You forgot me," it said again, voice low and grating, like nails on metal. Carl tried to confront it, swinging a heavy lamp, but the figure vanished in an instant, leaving only the chill and the stench of decay. The family huddled together, shaking, terrified to move or breathe. Even the children, who had been brave in their innocence, wept silently into their parents' arms. By morning, the storm had cleared, but the terror remained. The back door was damaged, scratched, and twisted as if something had tried to force its way in. The footprints outside, irregular and deep, led into the woods and ended abruptly. No explanation was possible, no one to report it to. The town of Millstone County would later dismiss any strange events as an overactive imagination fueled by stormy nights and holiday stress, but the Reynolds family knew the truth. Years later, Julia still felt the presence of that night. Every Christmas, she would glance toward the window overlooking the woods and shiver at the thought of the hollow eyes watching. Michael and Lily carried nightmares into adulthood, dreams filled with shadows, dragging footsteps, and whispers calling their names. Even Carl and Denise never again found comfort in their home, always checking locks, windows, and corners of rooms for something that never truly left. Some families speak of Christmas memories with warmth, but the Reynolds family spoke in hushed tones about fear, about shadows that don't belong, and a figure that returned to remind them that some grudges don't die with the person who held them. Some visitors, it seemed, never left. Every snowfall, every winter wind carries with it the memory of that night, the scraping at the doors, the dragging footsteps across the floor, the hollow whisper, "You forgot me." Story the end. The snow had been falling since morning, thick and heavy, covering the quiet streets of Hanover, New Hampshire, in a dense blanket of white. It was Christmas Eve, and the small town was nearly deserted, save for the occasional car that struggled through the snow-packed roads. The Thompson family lived on the outskirts of town in a 2-story colonial house that had been in Dan's family for generations. That year, the house felt different, heavier somehow, as if the winter storm pressed against the walls with purpose. Dan Thompson had been at work all day at the local warehouse, a seasonal rush that never seemed to end, while his wife Claire stayed home with their two children, Jacob, 8, and Emily, 5. Claire had spent the day preparing for Christmas, decorating the tree with handmade ornaments and stringing lights along the staircase. The children darted around the living room, dragging out their stockings and giggling as they imagined Santa arriving. But as the afternoon sun dipped behind the hills, a strange unease settled over the house. It started subtly, a low, almost imperceptible scratching from the back of the house, like fingernails against the siding. Claire paused while untangling the lights, listening, but dismissed it as the wind. Jacob, however, frowned, his brow furrowed. "Mom, there's someone outside," he whispered. Claire turned to look out the window, but all she could see was the snow obscuring the yard. "It's just the snow, honey," she said, forcing a smile. "Nobody's out there." Emily tugged on her mother's sleeve. "I don't like it," she said, shivering despite her sweater. As evening approached, the storm intensified. The wind howled, and the house seemed to groan with the cold. Claire lit the fireplace, hoping the warmth and flickering light would comfort the children. When Dan finally arrived, late and snow-drenched, the house was cozy, but even he felt the tension in the air. He shrugged it off, blaming the storm, and began helping Claire hang ornaments on the tree. By 10 o'clock, the children were in bed, and Dan and Claire settled on the couch with mugs of hot chocolate. That's when the first knock came, soft, deliberate from the back door. They froze. It was late, the roads impassable. No one should be there. "Maybe a branch," Dan suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. The knocking continued slowly, almost methodically, until it stopped as abruptly as it began. Claire's heart raced. She locked the doors and windows, double-checked the back door, and returned to the living room, insisting everything was fine. But then came the whispers, soft, almost melodic, seeming to come from every corner of the house at once. "Jacob, Emily, Mom, Dad." Claire clutched Dan's arm. "Did you hear that?" Dan nodded, his jaw tight. "I thought I did. Probably just the wind, though." But the house didn't stay still. Lights flickered, the fireplace dimmed, and shadows shifted unnaturally along the walls. Claire grabbed her phone to call the police, but there was no signal, not even a dial tone. Panic crept in, and when she went to the window, she saw it, a figure standing beyond the yard, partially obscured by the snow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and completely black, like a silhouette drained of detail. It didn't move, but its presence was heavy, oppressive, and utterly silent. "Dan, there's someone out there," she whispered, voice trembling. Dan went to the window, squinting through the storm, and froze. The figure was closer now, not walking but seeming to glide just above the snow, and its head turned slowly toward the house. A chill raced down his spine. The family huddled together in the living room, trying to convince themselves it was a trick of the storm. Hours passed in silence except for the occasional creak of the house. But then came the footsteps, soft at first, then growing louder, pacing just outside the front door. Claire peered through the blinds and saw no tracks in the snow leading to the house, as though the figure moved without leaving a trace. When midnight struck, the house plunged into darkness. The flickering of the lights ceased entirely, and the fireplace exhaled a cold, unnatural draft that raised frost along the windowsills. Claire screamed when she saw movement in the living room. The shadowy figure had somehow appeared inside, its form taller than any human, its long, skeletal arms stretching toward them. Dan grabbed a baseball bat and advanced cautiously, but the figure didn't retreat. Its face remained hidden beneath a dark hood, but Claire swore she could see glowing red eyes, and the whispers returned, louder now, closer. "You're mine. All of you." Panic set in. Dan tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Windows were frozen shut, and even the back door, which he had bolted, refused to open. The house had become a prison, and the shadowed figure was the guard. Hours stretched into eternity. Claire clutched the children, who were trembling with fear, while Dan tried to maintain some semblance of order. But every time they moved, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and grow, crawling along the walls, forming shapes that mimicked their movements with a grotesque delay. Jacob whispered that the figure was speaking to him, telling him to come closer, promising gifts if he did. Emily cried softly, clutching her stuffed rabbit, claiming she could see the figure's hands reaching toward the tree. Claire's mind raced. The tree, once bright and cheerful, now looked sinister. the ornaments casting dark reflections that seemed alive. By dawn, the storm had passed. The first rays of sunlight cut through the frost-covered windows, revealing the devastation of the night. But the family was gone. Neighbors who later came to check on the Thompsons reported the house appeared empty, untouched, no signs of struggle, yet the interior temperature was frigid, and frost clung unnaturally to the walls. The Christmas tree remained decorated, but its lights flickered as if powered by something otherworldly. Rumors spread through Hanover. Some claimed the Thompsons had been taken by a spirit that roamed the town every Christmas Eve, drawn to houses filled with warmth and happiness. Others said the storm had been unnatural, a veil concealing something ancient and malevolent. People reported glimpses of a tall, thin figure moving just beyond the tree line, shadows that shifted against the snow, and whispers calling names in the dead of night. Years passed, but the story never left the town. Families moved, houses were sold, but the tale of the Thompsons remained a warning that some Christmases carry more than joy, that the winter's cold can hide horrors beyond understanding, and that a shadow can watch and wait, patient and eternal, for the next family to celebrate. Even now, locals swear that during heavy snowstorms, when the roads are empty and the wind howls, you can see a tall, dark figure standing silently at the edge of the woods, its eyes glowing red, waiting for the warmth of human cheer to find its way into its grasp. Those who've had the misfortune of crossing its gaze report chills, whispers in the wind, and a feeling of being watched long after the storm ends. Hanover learned to lock doors tightly, to leave lights burning through the night, and to keep children close, but even caution offers no guarantee. Some say the house on the Thompson property still stands, frozen in time. The windows remain frosted over, the wreath on the door encased in ice, and no one dares enter. Occasionally, someone walking by will see movement behind the glass, a shadow stretching unnaturally, a red glow in the corner of a room. But by the time they blink, the house appears empty again. The legend grew. The Watcher of Hanover, some called it, a creature that preyed on families during the holiday, drawn to warmth, laughter, and light, and turning it into fear, despair, and disappearance. And every Christmas Eve, as the snow begins to fall thick and silent, residents whisper prayers and lock their doors, hoping against hope that the Watcher will pass them by, looking instead for another house to haunt, another family to trap inside the chilling grip of Christmas horror. Story the end. The snow was coming down hard that Christmas Eve in Cedar Falls, Michigan, blanketing the town in a thick, quiet white. Streetlights glowed softly through the snowfall, reflecting off the icy roads and frozen sidewalks. In the Martin household, a small two-story home on the edge of town, the family was finishing the last preparations for Christmas. Julie Martin, 34, was bustling around the kitchen, frosting cookies with her two children, Lily, age 8, and Danny, age 6. Her husband, David, was untangling strings of Christmas lights that had somehow become hopelessly knotted. The smell of pine from the Christmas tree mixed with the warmth of baking bread, giving the house that familiar, comforting holiday scent. But something about the night felt off, the kind of off that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. It was subtle at first, small noises, fleeting shadows, things easily dismissed. The family chalked it up to the storm outside or perhaps a trick of the dim light. Around 7 o'clock, Julie noticed the dog, Max, acting strangely. Usually he was calm and friendly, but tonight he wouldn't leave the corner of the living room near the window. He growled low in his throat, hackles raised, staring into the snowy darkness outside. "Max, come here," Julie said, trying to coax him with a gentle hand. But he refused, staring harder, lips curled, a low rumble vibrating from his chest. David glanced up, concerned, and saw nothing outside but swirling snow. Later, as the children prepared their milk and cookies for Santa, Lily suddenly froze, staring toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. "Mom, someone's there," she whispered. Julie's eyes followed her daughter's gaze but saw nothing. She crouched beside Lily, brushing her hair back. "It's probably just your imagination, honey. It's dark, and the shadows can play tricks on you." Danny, however, remained unconvinced. "I saw him too, Mom. He's tall and really skinny." His voice trembled. Julie forced a reassuring smile, but a shiver ran down her spine despite the warmth of the house. After tucking the kids into bed, Julie returned to the living room, trying to convince herself nothing was wrong. David had finally finished the lights and plugged them in, but the bulbs flickered erratically, some going out entirely before bursting back to life. Probably the storm messing with the power, he muttered, though he sounded less certain than he wanted to appear. It wasn't until the first knock came that their unease became terror. One soft knock, then another, then another. Deliberate, slow, measured, coming from the front door. Julie froze, listening. There was no wind, no branches scraping the siding, nothing that could have caused the sound. David went to the door, peered through the peephole, and saw nothing, just the snow-covered porch, empty. He opened the door cautiously. The steps were pristine, untouched, no footprints in sight. "What the hell?" David muttered, closing the door. Julie felt a tight knot form in her stomach. "Someone's out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was no one. That night, the house seemed to come alive in the wrong way. The lights in the living room flickered constantly. Shadows stretched and moved across the walls, though there was no source. Max barked intermittently at corners where there was nothing. And then came the whispers, soft at first, unintelligible, like wind through the cracks in the walls. But soon they became clearer. Names. Danny's name, Lily's name, David's name, Julie's name, spoken in the faintest, most deliberate tone. David grabbed a flashlight and moved from room to room, trying to locate the source. Every hallway seemed longer than it should be, every corner darker, and then, in the dining room, he saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall, thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too angular, standing perfectly still near the far wall. Its head was tilted, watching. It didn't move, but the sense of being watched, of being targeted, was suffocating. Julie came into the room and screamed when she saw it. The figure vanished instantly, as if it had never been there. But the feeling remained. A cold pressure in the air, a weight on their chests. By midnight, the storm outside had worsened, and the power flickered repeatedly. The family huddled in the living room, unsure if they could sleep. That's when Lily spoke, her small voice trembling. "He's in my room. He's standing there." Julie and David rushed upstairs. Lily clutched her blanket, eyes wide, pointing to the corner. There was nothing visible, but both parents felt it. A presence dark and heavy, pressing down, filling the room with dread. Danny, who had been sleeping, now sat upright, staring at the far wall. "I see him too," he whispered. Julie tried to calm them. It's okay. Go back to sleep." But her own hands shook. The shadows in the hallway seemed to ripple, move toward them ever so slightly. The next morning, Christmas Day, the house seemed deceptively normal. The snowstorm had stopped and sunlight streamed through the windows. But the small details told a different story. Ornaments were missing from the tree, some broken, others rearranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, grotesque. A trail of muddy footprints led from the hallway to the kitchen, though no one had been outside. And worst of all, in the living room, a small, crude wooden figure sat upright on the mantel. A thin, carved humanoid with hollow eyes that seemed to follow anyone who moved in the room. "Where did this come from?" Julie asked, dread pooling in her stomach. David shook his head, no answer forthcoming. He tried to dismiss it as a prank or some leftover decoration from last year, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. Every time they looked at it, the feeling of being watched intensified. Over the next few days, the family tried to go about their lives, but normalcy was impossible. The figure appeared in different places, on the staircase, sitting on a chair, sometimes on the windowsill, always watching, always present. The children stopped sleeping in their rooms, insisting they stay with their parents. Max refused to enter certain areas of the house, growling continuously at corners where nothing appeared to exist. Julie started seeing shapes in the corner of her vision, shadows that stretched and twisted, following her as she moved. Doors she had closed were open again when she returned. Objects shifted, small but unnerving. A spoon missing from the kitchen, a chair moved slightly. And every night, the whispering grew louder. Names, commands, something incomprehensible yet chillingly clear. By New Year's Eve, the family was exhausted and terrified. They had contacted neighbors, friends, even the local police, but no one reported anything unusual in the area. It was as if the house itself had become a vessel for something unseen, something that fed on fear and the illusion of safety. One night, the figure appeared in the living room again. This time, it moved. Slow, deliberate, and with a gait that was wrong, angular, almost unnatural. Julie screamed, and the children clung to her. David tried to confront it, swinging a chair, but the figure vanished, leaving behind only the oppressive silence and the feeling of being suffocated by darkness. Desperate, the family packed their belongings and left Cedar Falls. They didn't tell anyone why, only claiming they were moving due to work. The house remained empty, but locals reported strange occurrences. Lights flickering inside at night, shadows moving behind frosted windows, and faint whispers in the winter wind. Years later, Julie still felt the presence during every Christmas. Even miles away, she would wake at night, certain someone was standing at the foot of her bed. Danny, now a teenager, confided that he sometimes dreamed of the figure, standing silently, watching, waiting. Lily refused to put up a Christmas tree, saying the ornaments look like eyes. The house on Elm Street, the Martin house, still stands, vacant, untouched, but alive in its own way. Those who pass by swear they see movement behind the windows, hear scratching on the walls, or catch the faint outline of a tall, thin figure watching from the shadows. The town has learned to avoid it, especially during the holidays. No one dares enter. And the wooden figure? Some say it sits somewhere inside, waiting, its hollow eyes fixed on the next family foolish enough to celebrate Christmas there. Story the end. The snow started falling the night before Christmas in the small town of Willow Creek. A thick, heavy snow that coated every roof, tree, and street lamp in a silent, oppressive white. The streets were empty by evening, save for the occasional car braving the slick roads, its tires crunching against the snow. In a modest brick house at the end of Pinewood Lane, the Anderson family was putting the finishing touches on their Christmas preparations. Mark Anderson had spent the day bringing home firewood, stringing lights on the house, and making sure the tree was perfectly decorated. His wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen baking cookies with their 2 children, Sophie, 8, and Noah, 5. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. The tree twinkled with multicolored lights, stockings hung along the fireplace, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. But Mark couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been creeping over him all day, an unshakable sense that something was wrong. It started subtly. When Mark went outside to check the lights, he thought he saw someone standing across the street, shrouded in the falling snow. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Inside, he heard faint scratching noises coming from the basement, almost like nails being dragged along concrete. Sarah laughed when he mentioned it, saying it was just the old house settling, but the sound persisted. Every so often it would stop, only to start again in a different part of the house. That night, after dinner, the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then went out entirely, leaving the house in a thick darkness, broken only by the glow of the fireplace. Mark grabbed a flashlight and checked the circuit breaker, but everything appeared normal. As he turned to leave, a soft tapping sound echoed from the hallway upstairs, slow and deliberate. He called out, but no one answered. The kids were supposed to be in bed. Mark moved cautiously toward the stairs, the tapping following him, as if keeping pace. Halfway up, he saw a shadow move across the wall, a tall, thin shape that didn't belong to any member of his family. His heart pounded, and he froze. The shadow didn't move like a person. It glided impossibly smooth, then vanished when he tried to focus on it. Mark reached the kids' bedroom. Sophie and Noah were asleep, curled under their blankets, but the door to the closet creaked open slowly as if pushed by a hand. He stepped inside, flashlight trembling in his hand. Nothing. But when he turned to leave, the closet door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in near darkness. He pounded on it, calling for Sarah, but all that came back was a distorted, echoing laughter that seemed to crawl along the walls. Panic surged through him. He finally forced the door open and ran downstairs, the laughter following him, growing louder, overlapping with whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah was in the living room, holding the kids close. "Mark?" she whispered. Her voice trembled. He grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." But when they tried the front door, it wouldn't budge. The windows were locked tight, and even the garage door refused to open. The family was trapped. The whispers turned into voices, low and guttural, speaking in unison. "Stay. Stay with us. Forever." Shadows began crawling along the walls, twisting and stretching into grotesque forms. Mark grabbed a chair, trying to fend them off, but his hands passed through the shadows as if they were smoke. Sophie started screaming, but it wasn't her voice. It was layered with hundreds of others, children and adults alike, all crying, laughing, and whispering at the same time. Then a figure appeared in the corner of the living room. At first, Mark thought it was a burglar, a man in a dark coat. But as the flashlight illuminated it, he realized it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, bending at impossible angles, and its face was featureless, except for two glowing red eyes. The creature moved silently, gliding across the floor, and the whispers grew louder. Mark tried to protect his family, swinging the chair, shouting, but the creature was faster, almost inside his head. The children began crying uncontrollably, repeating phrases they had never said before. Come with us, stay forever. Sarah screamed as another shadow stretched out, wrapping itself around her. Mark lunged forward, but it passed through her like she was made of mist. The shadows coalesced into forms that resembled people, faces distorted in fear and rage, their mouths open in silent screams. Then the house shifted. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as the shadows multiplied. The fireplace erupted in black smoke, filling the room with a choking fog. The Christmas tree's lights blinked erratically, casting strange, moving patterns on the walls. Through the swirling darkness, Mark saw glimpses of figures, other families frozen in terror, their faces pale, their eyes wide, trapped within the shadows. Sophie and Noah were lifted from the floor, held by unseen hands. They screamed, but the sound was drowned by the cacophony of whispers and laughter. Mark tried to reach them, but the shadows repelled him, pressing against his chest, making it impossible to move. Sarah's eyes went black, and she whispered the same words over and over. They're coming. They're coming. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched into hours. Mark felt himself being pulled toward the darkness, toward the voices that promised warmth and safety if he would only give in. He fought, screamed, but it was futile. One by one, he felt his family slip from his grasp, their bodies dissolving into shadow. And then, he was alone. Morning came in Willow Creek, silent and deceptively peaceful. The storm had passed. The neighbors noticed the Anderson house was dark, but no one thought much of it at first. When someone finally knocked on the door, there was no answer. The police were called. When they entered, the house was pristine. The tree, decorations, and presents were untouched. The only signs of disturbance were faint smudges on the windows and an unnatural chill that clung to the air. The Anderson family was gone. No trace, no evidence, no footprints in the snow. The only clue was a single line of tiny, blackened footprints leading from the front door to the edge of the woods behind the house, where they abruptly ended. People whispered for years about what had happened that night. Some said it was a demonic presence, others that the house itself had consumed the family. But no one could explain the blackened toys and figurines left on the tree and in the stockings. Over the next decade, the house remained abandoned. Locals avoided it, claiming they could hear whispers carried by the wind, see shadows moving behind the windows, or even glimpse figures watching from the attic. Every Christmas Eve, daring children would sneak onto the property, only to run screaming back to their parents, claiming the house was alive, breathing, and watching them. Some nights, if the wind blew from the north and the snow fell just right, people claimed they could hear children crying in the distance, calling out for parents that would never return. The old Christmas tree remained visible through the front window, its lights flickering faintly, ornaments slightly out of place as if something invisible had been moving through the house. Visitors who lingered too long reported a feeling of being watched, a creeping dread that clung to their skin and made the air feel heavy. The Anderson house became a legend in Willow Creek, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide beneath the beauty of Christmas. Neighbors told stories of families disappearing, shadows creeping across walls, and whispers that could lure even the most cautious into the unknown. No one ever lived in the house again, but every Christmas Eve the lights would flicker faintly, the ornaments would shift, and the wind would carry a soft chorus of voices, "Stay with us forever." Story the end. The Thompson family had always loved Christmas. Living in a small town in upstate New York, the holidays were the highlight of their year. Their home was modest but cozy, a two-story house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by dense woods that muffled the outside world in winter. That year, the air was crisp, the snow falling in heavy, silent sheets, blanketing the streets and lawns. Dan Thompson, the father, had taken the week off work to spend time with his family. His wife, Marie, was busy baking cookies with their children, Lily, 9, and Ben, 6. The tree had been set up early, ornaments carefully arranged, lights twinkling through the living room. Everything seemed perfect. It started innocuously enough on Christmas Eve. Dan had gone out to shovel the driveway after a fresh snowfall, while the rest of the family stayed inside decorating cookies. He noticed footprints in the snow that didn't belong to anyone in the household, small, oddly shaped, like children's shoes, but with clawed edges. He shrugged it off as a neighbor's kid wandering through the yard. Later, when he mentioned it, Marie dismissed it too, assuming it had been a deer or a dog passing through. After dinner, the family gathered around the tree. Gifts were exchanged, and laughter filled the room. Lily and Ben were especially excited about the presents under the tree. But as the night wore on, Marie noticed something strange. One of the ornaments, a small wooden angel she had received as a child, had moved. It was now lying on the floor, though no one had touched it. She picked it up, chalking it up to her imagination, and placed it back on the branch. Around 10 p.m., the children were supposed to be asleep, but Lily came running into the living room, eyes wide with fear. "I heard someone whispering my name," she said. Dan and Marie exchanged uneasy glances. They tried to reassure her, attributing it to holiday excitement or dreams, but a gnawing sense of unease settled in their stomachs. Shortly after, the power flickered, plunging the house into momentary darkness. Dan went to check the fuse box while Marie stayed with the kids. When he returned, he found the angel ornament had moved again, now perched on the mantel above the fireplace, facing them with an eerie tilt. Its painted eyes seemed sharper somehow, almost lifelike. At around midnight, things escalated. The whispering returned, louder, more insistent. Marie could make out words now, though barely. "Stay, stay, don't leave." The children clung to her, trembling. Dan tried to call 911, but the phone lines were dead. Then the lights went out completely. Candles were lit, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move on their own, twisting and stretching, as if alive. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from upstairs, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps pacing across the children's bedrooms. Dan grabbed a flashlight and cautiously ascended the stairs. The hall was empty, doors closed, yet the footsteps continued. When he reached the top, the air was icy, his breath visible even though the heat was on. Then he saw it. A shadow moving at the end of the hallway, humanoid but distorted, taller than any person should be, gliding just above the floor. He tried to call out, but no sound came from his mouth. The figure moved toward him, and the flashlight flickered violently. In the living room, Marie and the children huddled together. The angel ornament had appeared again, now on the floor, its face pointing toward the stairs, as if guiding the figure toward them. Panic set in. Dan tried to grab it, but it felt impossibly heavy, like stone. When he finally managed to lift it, the figure stopped, then slowly dissipated into shadows that clung to the corners of the walls. The whispering escalated into chanting, a low, guttural rhythm that filled every inch of the house. The family barricaded themselves in the living room, using furniture to block the doors. But the house seemed alive, the walls groaning, floors creaking as if responding to some unseen force. Every few minutes, the ornament would appear somewhere new, on the stairs, on the kitchen table, even in the hallway, always facing them. Its expression seemed to change, a subtle widening of its smile that grew more grotesque each time. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time felt distorted. At one point, Lily whispered that she could see a figure in the window, standing in the snow, watching them. Dan looked outside but saw nothing, only the thick snowfall and shadows cast by the bare trees. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, a cold, suffocating presence that pressed against them from all sides. By early morning, the whispering stopped suddenly. Exhausted, they slumped on the floor, afraid to sleep. When they finally dared to look around, the house was empty. The angel ornament sat on the mantel, perfectly still, its painted eyes staring directly at them. But there were other signs. Footprints in the snow outside led to the front door, but they were odd, mismatched, and ended abruptly in the middle of the yard. Dan tried to leave, driving the family to his parents' house several miles away, but the car wouldn't start. Every attempt to call for help failed. Cell phones were dead, and even the landline was silent. The family returned home, trapped in a loop that felt endless. Over the next few days, neighbors noticed the Thompson house was quiet. Too quiet. Windows were frosted over. No smoke from the chimney. Some reported seeing lights flickering inside late at night, strange shadows moving across the curtains. A few brave souls approached the door, but it was locked tight and no one answered. The family was never seen again. Years later, the house still stands at the end of that quiet street, avoided by locals who claim you can hear whispers in the wind when the snow falls. Some say the angel ornament can be seen from the street, perched on the mantel, its eyes glowing faintly even at night, smiling in a way no ornament should. Children whisper that it watches them, and adults insist that strange footprints appear in the snow, leading to the house but never leaving. The story became a warning in the town. Never accept strange gifts, never leave your doors unlocked on Christmas Eve, and always pay attention to the shadows. Some say the Thompson family is still inside, trapped in the house, living Christmas forever under the watch of the cursed ornament. And every Christmas, when the wind howls through the trees and snow falls thick and heavy, neighbors report hearing faint whispers, faint laughter, and the soft sound of footsteps pacing inside the abandoned house, waiting for the next family foolish enough to disturb its darkness. Story, the end. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Harper's Hollow, a quiet corner of upstate New York that seemed frozen in time. Snow blanketed the streets and rooftops, the kind of heavy, damp snow that stuck to everything it touched. The holiday lights glimmered on the few storefronts that lined Main Street, and the scent of pine from freshly cut trees mixed with the sweet aroma of bakery treats spilling from local shops. Families bustled through the snow-laden sidewalks, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, their laughter and chatter echoing faintly through the frosty air. But for the Winters family, the holiday cheer felt distant, almost hollow. Laura Winters, a nurse who had just finished her late shift at the hospital, trudged through the snow carrying a bag full of groceries. She had promised her 2 children, Emma and Tyler, a special Christmas dinner, and she was determined to make it happen despite the blizzard that had descended earlier in the day. Her husband, Tom, was stuck at the hospital as well, called in for an emergency shift. Laura's mind was half on the food, half on the storm, and half on the uneasy feeling she couldn't shake from the moment she left the store. When she entered the house, the warmth hit her immediately, but it did little to calm her nerves. The kids were in the living room, playing near the Christmas tree, their small faces glowing in the flickering lights. She smiled at them, trying to shake off the tension from the drive home. Everything seemed fine. Too fine. There was no sound beyond the crackle of the fire and the occasional hum of the refrigerator, which made the silence feel thicker, almost suffocating. Laura unpacked the groceries, her hands shaking slightly as she set out ingredients for the evening's meal. The storm outside had intensified, and the windows rattled under the pressure of the wind. It sounded like someone or something was tapping at the glass. She paused and looked, but the world outside was nothing but white, blinding snow. No movement, no figure. Still, the sense of being watched gnawed at her. Around 6 o'clock, Tom called from the hospital. His voice was tired but cheerful. "Almost done here. Dinner smell good?" he asked. Laura smiled, telling him yes, and they exchanged a few brief words about the kids. After the call ended, she went to check on Emma and Tyler, but they were staring at the corner of the room, frozen and pale. "Mom," Emma whispered. "The man, he's by the window." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "What man?" she asked, trying to sound calm. Emma shook her head. "He's just there, watching." Laura forced a laugh, attributing it to her daughter's vivid imagination. Tyler nodded, his small fingers clutching at the edge of the blanket. Laura reassured them, telling them it was just the shadows from the tree, the flickering lights playing tricks. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The evening passed in uneasy quiet. Dinner was served, and the kids ate mechanically, their eyes occasionally darting to the windows. Laura tried to enjoy the meal, but every few minutes she caught herself staring toward the darkened corners of the living room, every shadow making her flinch. When she finally went to clean the dishes, she heard a distinct sound, a slow, deliberate tapping at the kitchen window. Her breath caught. She went to the window, peering through the frost and snow, but there was nothing. The yard was empty, save for the thick snow that covered the ground. Still, the unease grew. Around 9 o'clock, the lights flickered and went out. Laura cursed under her breath, grabbing candles and matches. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the small flames that trembled on the countertops. The children huddled close to her, whispering fears she couldn't fully soothe. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, then heavier, rhythmic. Laura froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, intentional. Someone was at the door. She called Tom, but there was no answer. The line was dead. Panic rising, she checked the locks on all the doors and windows. Everything was secure. Yet the knocking continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from outside the house. The children began crying, their fear palpable. Laura grabbed a flashlight and crept to the back door, peering through the small glass panel. At first she saw nothing, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement, a tall figure, impossibly thin, standing among the snow-laden trees at the edge of their yard. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly red in the dim light. Laura's hands trembled as she backed away. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem aware she was watching. But then it raised one long, spindly hand and pointed toward the house, and the knocking stopped. Silence fell, so heavy it felt almost tangible. The children clung to her, shivering, and for a moment Laura considered calling the police. But she didn't. Something about the figure made her doubt it would respond like a normal threat. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this world. The hours stretched long. Laura stayed awake, holding the kids close, listening to every creak of the house, every groan of the old wood under the weight of the storm. Occasionally, she thought she saw movement in the corner of the windows, the shadows shifting just beyond her sight. Once, she swore she heard whispering, words carried on the wind that she couldn't understand. She felt the figure watching them all night, its presence pressing against the house like the snow outside, inescapable and silent. By dawn, the storm had eased, leaving a pale gray light filtering through the frost-covered windows. Laura, exhausted, ventured outside to assess the damage and perhaps find some sign of the visitor. The snow was untouched except for one set of footprints leading from the woods directly to the front porch, stopping abruptly at the door. No footprints led away. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a lingering sense of dread. Over the next few days, the family tried to return to normal. The town buzzed with news of strange sightings during the storm, people reporting shadowy figures near their homes, odd sounds in the night, and, in some cases, items inexplicably moving or disappearing. Laura spoke with neighbors, many of whom had experienced the same terrifying night. It was as if Harper's Hollow had been visited by something that slipped between the cracks of reality, something that came only in the dead of winter when the world was silent and frozen. Weeks passed, but the feeling of being watched never fully left. Laura and Tom installed cameras, checked locks obsessively, and even considered moving. Yet every Christmas, as the snow begins to fall and the nights grow long, Laura notices the shadows at the edge of her yard, hears the faint tapping at her windows, and feels the unmistakable silent gaze of the man, or whatever he is, watching, waiting, patient and eternal. The children, now older, refuse to sleep in their rooms during the holiday season. And Laura has learned to dread the snow, for it brings with it the memory of the night their perfect Christmas became something else entirely. A night that reminds her that not all horrors are found in movies, and some visit quietly, under the guise of a holiday miracle. Every year she whispers a silent prayer on Christmas Eve, hoping that the figure does not return. But deep down, she knows better. Some things, once they choose you, never leave. The Winters family has learned the hard way that the terror they endured was real, that the shadows outside their home were not imagination, and that the quiet beauty of a snow-covered Christmas can hide the darkest of horrors. Story the end. The wind was relentless that Christmas Eve in rural Vermont, whipping through the pine trees and rattling the old windows of the Thompson farmhouse. Snow had been falling steadily for 2 days, layering the world in white and silencing the usual hum of life. Inside, the Thompson family tried to make the best of it. There was laughter in the kitchen as Sarah Thompson, 35, decorated sugar cookies with her children, Jacob, 8, and Emma, 6. Her husband, Paul, was outside stacking firewood for the night, his breath visible in the cold air. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened, the snow thickening to the point where visibility dropped to barely a few feet. Paul came inside, shaking snow from his coat and boots, and flicked on the lights. The house, built in the 1800s, creaked under the wind's assault. It had been in his family for generations, and though he had grown up there, he had never felt it quite like this. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, but the mood had shifted from festive to tense without anyone realizing it. The children were unusually quiet, their faces pale despite the warmth from the fireplace. After dinner, Paul went to check the generator in the shed, as the storm had knocked out power intermittently. He paused when he noticed footprints in the snow near the edge of the property. That was odd, considering the nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away. He followed them, his curiosity piqued, but the tracks stopped abruptly at the tree line. A chill ran down his spine. He returned to the house, dismissing it as an animal or a trick of the wind. Later, as the children were brushing their teeth, Sarah heard a soft tapping on the living room window. At first, she thought it was just snow or ice hitting the glass, but the tapping continued, regular, deliberate, almost like knuckles rapping. She called out for Paul, but he was upstairs checking on the firewood he had stacked inside. "It's probably nothing," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The power went out completely at 8 p.m., plunging the house into darkness. Paul lit candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows across the walls. Sarah tucked the children into bed, their whispers soft but unceasing. Jacob murmured about a man standing outside the window, but Sarah dismissed it as a bad dream, though a knot of unease had formed in her stomach. Around 9:30 p.m., there was a sound from the attic, footsteps, slow and methodical. Paul grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs, but found nothing. The attic was empty, save for the boxes of holiday decorations. He called Sarah up to reassure him, but neither of them felt the sense of relief they hoped for. Then from the kitchen came a crash, something heavy falling. Paul ran down, heart hammering, and saw the back door swinging open, snow blowing into the house. He slammed it shut, but that's when they noticed the writing on the fridge door, smeared in what looked like dirt or ash. "Get out!" The children were crying now, clinging to Sarah, whispering that someone was under the bed. Paul tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe the children were scared by the storm, but he couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. He decided to call his brother, Dave, who lived 20 miles away. The phone line was dead. Even cell service was non-existent. Panic began to set in. Sarah suggested they lock all the doors and stay together, but the unease was spreading like a cold fire. Suddenly, a loud knock came from the front door, followed by a whisper that seemed to crawl into the room. "Open the door." Paul shook his head, trying to convince himself it was the wind, but the whisper repeated, clearer this time, "Open the door." Jacob clutched his mother and pointed toward the hallway. "He's there," he said. "He's in the hallway." Paul's flashlight swept the hallway, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow dart past. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it tightly, as Paul edged toward the front door. The knocking intensified, now joined by a scratching sound, like someone clawing at the wood. They heard whispers now, voices overlapping, some low and guttural, some high-pitched, all repeating, get out, leave." Emma started screaming suddenly, pointing to the living room. There, in the flickering candlelight, a figure crouched near the Christmas tree. It was thin, impossibly thin, with long limbs and an elongated face partially hidden by shadows. Its eyes reflected the candlelight, unnaturally bright. Sarah screamed, and the figure bolted toward the hallway. Paul tried to chase it, but as he stepped into the hallway, the figure vanished. The doors slammed shut on their own, trapping them inside. The whispers grew louder, echoing in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The children screamed for their mother, who was trying to calm them while holding the knife like a lifeline. Then the fireplace erupted in a burst of flames, not from the firewood, but from nowhere. Smoke filled the room, and in the shadows the words appeared, as if burned into the air itself. "You can't stay." Paul felt a hand brush his shoulder. He spun around, swinging the flashlight, but there was nothing, only the feeling of icy fingers wrapping around him. Sarah clutched the children, shaking uncontrollably. They could hear footsteps in every room, circling, approaching, retreating, always just out of sight. Hours passed like this. Time seemed to stretch and bend until finally around 3 a.m. the noises stopped. The house was silent, the storm outside having eased slightly. Paul and Sarah sat huddled in the living room, eyes darting toward every shadow, waiting for the nightmare to return. Morning brought no relief. The house looked untouched by the chaos of the night, as if nothing had happened. But the children were pale, exhausted, and whispered constantly about the man in the dark. When neighbors came by, worried about the storm, the Thompsons couldn't explain the bruises on their arms or the deep scratches on the walls, fresh and jagged. The neighbors chalked it up to the children bumping into furniture in the dark, but Paul and Sarah knew better. Christmas came and went, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every year after, around December, strange things would happen in the Thompson house. Doors would lock on their own, whispers would echo through empty rooms, and shadows moved against the walls with no source. The children grew up, but Jacob and Emma never spoke of that night to anyone, and they refused to ever sleep alone in the house again. Paul eventually moved the family away, unable to endure the terror of another winter. The farmhouse still stands, abandoned now, windows dark, snow piling on the roof. Locals avoid it, claiming the place is cursed, that the spirit, or something far worse, still prowls the halls every Christmas, waiting for the next family to light the tree and invite it in. Sometimes, during the stormiest nights, people passing by claim they can see the flicker of candlelight in the windows, the shadow of a tall, thin figure gliding across the floor, and they hear whispers carried on the wind, urging them to leave before it's too late. Story the end.